doors to the council chamber had barely closed behind the departing delegates before something inside the room changed. It was not a sound anyone could name clearly afterward. The two guards stationed at the end of the long corridor would describe it to each other late that evening as pressure, the kind of atmospheric weight that precedes a storm when the sky has not yet committed to what it is going to do. A young steward carrying a tray of water pitchers said he felt it in his chest before anything reached his ears at all, and he set the tray down on the nearest table and stood very still, the way an animal stands when it cannot determine from which direction the danger is coming. Beta Ryden was in the outer corridor reviewing a border clause amendment with council member Owen Blaine when the pressure reached them. He stopped mid-sentence. The parchment was still in his hand. Owen looked at him. Ryden was already moving. He reached the chamber doors in 12 seconds. He pressed one palm flat against the wood, held it there for a single breath to take the measure of what was on the other side, and then he pushed through. The first thing he registered was the long council table, still intact. The second was the eastern window, the one with the old iron latch that 3 separate stewards had filed maintenance requests about over the course of more than a year, hanging fully open. Not cracked, fully open. The cold November air was coming through it freely, moving the papers at the far end of the table. The latch itself was on the floor several feet from the wall, which meant it had not simply slipped loose from the frame. It had traveled. The third thing he saw was Kale. The Alpha King stood at the far end of the chamber with his back to the door, both hands braced flat on the edge of the council table, head down. His shoulders were rigid in the specific way of something holding a very heavy object in place, through will alone, and the sound coming from him was so low it barely qualified as sound at all, more vibration than noise, steady and contained and deeply, specifically wrong in the way that things which should not be compressed feel wrong when they are pressed down against their own nature. Ryden closed the door behind him. He did not move into the room. He had learned, over 3 years of standing as the person closest to the Alpha King of the Draven territories, that timing in these moments was the entire difference between helping and making everything considerably worse. He stood near the door and waited and read what he could from across the room. The delegates' papers were still spread across the table. 3 of the chairs along the south side had been pushed back hard enough to hit the stone wall behind them. A clay water pitcher lay on its side at the edge of the table, the water spreading slowly across the polished stone floor in a shape that had no hurry to it. The room smelled of disrupted air, the particular atmosphere of a space where something has happened that the walls are still absorbing. He waited. He was very good at waiting. After a long time, the Alpha King lifted his head. He straightened and turned around. Ryden looked at his eyes first. He always did this, checking the specific indicator before anything else. The gray of Kale Draven's eyes had a second color living in them, a silver that measured how far things had gone. Today the gray was threaded with it, bright in a way that did not belong there, like something with too much force behind it, pressing against the wrong side of glass. Not fully silver. That was the important distinction. Not fully silver meant the wolf had not entirely won this moment. It meant Kale was still present, still the one in the room who was making choices, still managing, which was the word he used for it, and a word Ryden had developed a complicated and increasingly careful relationship with over the course of the past 2 years. Ryden said, "The delegation? Gone." His voice was level. It almost always was. If you did not know to look at his eyes, you could convince yourself nothing was wrong at all. Ryden had stopped being fooled by this in the first year, but he understood why it worked on everyone else. Did they walk out, or did you? I ended the session. Ryden looked at the latch on the floor. He looked at the open window letting in the November cold. He said, Owen's agreement was supposed to be signed today. The Eastern Clause gives Harfin 3 days' notice on any river adjustment, renegotiate it to 14. 3 days is not enough notice. It is an invitation for Harfin to exploit the gap. I'll do that. Ryden paused. Kale. The Alpha King was already moving toward the east door, the private one, connecting the chamber to the corridor that ran back toward his quarters. Ryden had learned to read this movement for what it was, not retreat, which he had never observed from Kale, and did not expect to observe. This was a deliberate choice to remove himself from a space, before that space required more from him than he was willing to show in front of other people, which was, in its difficult and specific way, exactly the right decision. The healer should. No. Marin has suggested. No. Kale stopped at the east door. He did not turn back around. The healer looks at me, as though I am already broken. I am not broken. I am managing. He went through the door. It closed behind him, with a control that was itself a kind of statement, quiet and deliberate. Nothing broken at all in the way the door closed. Ryden stood alone in the empty chamber for a long moment. The water from the fallen pitcher was still moving across the floor, slow and patient. He stood and looked at it, and counted, in his memory, the number of council sessions in the past 3 months that had ended before their scheduled conclusion. He counted the summit in the spring. He counted the incident in the lower corridor the week before last. He counted the 3 separate mornings he had arrived at the East Wing and spent time standing outside the door, simply listening, before deciding it was safe to enter. He counted the explanations he had given to Felix Hart and to Owen Blaine and to the Harfin delegate who had noticed something different about the air in the room whenever the Alpha King arrived and had asked, with the careful indirectness of a man who understood the weight of the question, whether everything was all right. He lost count before he finished. He picked up the fallen pitcher, set it upright, and went to find Owen. Kale Draven had been Alpha King of the Draven territories for 7 years. He had taken the position at 24 when his father stepped down on grounds of age and health, and he had been prepared for it in every way that preparing for such a thing was possible. He had learned the full body of law that governed the pack territories. He had learned the history of every pack within the Draven umbrella, going back 6 generations. He had learned 7 regional dialects at varying degrees of competency, the mathematics of resource allocation, the mechanics of territorial dispute, and the particular and very specific skill of sitting in a room where everyone present wanted something from you, and giving each person exactly enough of what they needed, without giving anyone more than they had demonstrated they could be trusted to use responsibly. He had learned to fight, which had never been the difficult part, and to negotiate, which was sometimes harder, and to lead, which was the work of a lifetime and therefore never finished. The wolf had not been the problem, not in those first years. The Draven bloodline carried old wolves. The old lines were stronger, more instinct-driven, considerably more difficult to build a genuine working partnership with, but remarkable once that partnership formed. Kale's wolf was silver-gray, and large even by Draven standards, and in the first 4 years of his reign, the synchrony between them had been one of the most reliable things in his life. The wolf trusted his judgment. He trusted the wolf's instincts. They moved through decisions and crises and the accumulated pressures of governing thousands of people, with the confidence that came from 2 parts of the same being, who had learned each other well enough to get out of each other's way when it mattered most. Then came the events that the pack now referred to, in very careful and very indirect language, as the matter of the Hollow Treaty. Kale did not speak about it. He had not spoken about it when it happened, and he did not speak about it now, and the people around him had learned to treat this silence the way you treated a load-bearing wall, as something you did not probe or remove, because you could not be certain what it was holding up. Ryden knew pieces of the story, assembled from what he had witnessed, and what he had found in the records, and what Marin had let slip in careful fragments over months of conversation. The official records held the formal version, stripped of everything human, preserved in its political and territorial consequences only. The personal version lived inside Kale, in the same deep place where the wolf now kept its damage. A wolf did not process betrayal over time the way a person's mind might. This was the thing that healers and pack elders explained carefully to the people who lived alongside affected wolves. The thing that never became easier to hear no matter how carefully it was explained. A wolf registered a break in the trust it had given freely, and then it operated from that break, from the moment of it, permanently, as though the break were still happening right now. Because for the wolf, it was. The wolf did not distinguish clearly between then and now. It knew only what it knew, and what it knew was that the world had broken the trust it placed in it, and it would not be caught that way again. For 2 years and 6 months, the wolf had been operating from that knowledge. The consequences built in order. The sleeplessness came first, then the hypervigilance. The way Kale positioned himself near exits in every room he entered. The way his attention moved across arrivals, as though each one required assessment. The way the wolf treated every person who came within his personal space as a potential problem, until individually and slowly proven otherwise. Then the territorial expansion. The invisible radius around the Alpha King had grown, until entering the upper wing of the palace, without prior written authorization, confirmed in advance, was simply something that people had stopped doing, because the experience of doing it unprepared was one they did not wish to repeat. His judgment had remained sound. This was what kept the kingdom stable, what kept the council from open alarm, what kept the trade routes functioning, and the territorial agreements holding, and the pack hierarchies beneath his governance from finding reasons to push against him. Chaol Draven's decisions were still strategic. His ability to read a political situation and respond correctly was still largely intact. The wolf's damage had settled in the spaces around his thinking, rather than inside it, in the patience and the control and the capacity to sit in a room where tension built without having the wolf treat that tension as a direct threat, requiring a physical answer. The incidents were increasing. Raiden tracked them in a private journal. He showed it to no one. That evening, Chaol stood on the upper terrace of the East Tower, where the mountain wind came across the valley without anything to soften it, the cold absolute and exact, hitting him fully in the face. He had been coming to this terrace since he was 9 years old, when his father had first brought him here after a particularly difficult week, and told him plainly that the most important thing a leader would ever learn was how to stand still. At 9, he had found this advice completely unhelpful. At 31, with 2 years and 6 months of sleeplessness, and the wolf's pressure, and the increasing list of incidents behind him, he understood that his father had been telling him the only true thing there was, and that he had not understood it properly until he needed it most. The river far below held the last silver of the failing light, curving south through the valley floor, where the packlands ended and the neutral territory began. He had looked at this view in every season, every weather, every hour. There was something in its constancy that the wolf could register without distress. The river did not change its nature because of what was happening around it. It moved. It followed the channel it had always followed. It did not decide to be something else because the world around it was difficult. He heard the terrace door open behind him. He recognized the weight of the footstep and did not turn. "The delegation has agreed to reconvene tomorrow at mid-morning," Raiden said, coming to stand to his left at a considered distance. "I told them a scheduling matter had come up. They were not entirely satisfied, but they will return." "Good." Felix Harde asked, very carefully, whether the king was in good health. I told him yes. "Good." Chaol watched the river lose its last light. The valley was going dark from the eastern end, shadow moving across the grass like a tide. Raiden was quiet for a time in the way he was sometimes quiet, present but not demanding anything from his presence. After a while he said, "Marin came to see me this afternoon." Chaol said nothing. He listened. She used the phrase compound pressure. She said the pattern she has been watching does not resolve with time. She said, "Each incident puts more strain on the bond between you and the wolf, not less. And that." Raiden. "Yes. I know what it does." A silence. The wind came again, steady, cold. Then Raiden said, "She said she was watching something. She would come to me when she had something concrete to say. She asked whether anything unusual had happened recently. Situations that produced unexpected results regarding the wolf." Chaol turned his head slightly. "What kind of unexpected results?" "She didn't specify. She was watching. She said she would be clearer when she was certain." He thought about it. He thought through the past weeks methodically, the council incident today, the summit in the spring, the events of the week before last in the lower corridor that had required immediate management. He found nothing unusual in any of it. It was all, grimly and consistently, the same pattern he had been living with for over 2 years. He said so. Raiden nodded. He did not push further. They stood on the terrace until full dark came down, and the river was only a sound below them, and the mountains were shapes against a darker sky. Then Chaol went inside. He stood at the window of his chamber for a long time while the wolf circled, that low, restless motion that had replaced the wolf's stillness, searching for something it could not locate, turning and searching again. He watched the dark through the glass and told himself what he told himself every night, not because it always felt true, but because it was still true, by any honest measure. He was not broken. He was managing. These were not the same as fine, and he had stopped pretending they were, but they were also not the same as broken, and the distinction was the thing that kept the days going. The wolf circled. The night was long. Sleep came eventually, briefly, the way it always came, enough to survive the following day, not enough for anything beyond that. He had stopped hoping for more than that. Managing his own expectations was itself a form of managing. In the morning he would get up and the wolf would be where it always was, and the day would need what days always needed, and he would provide it. He had been doing this for 2 years and 6 months. He would keep doing it. He told himself this clearly, and he meant it, and he stood at the window until the cold of the glass came through to his hands, and eventually he went to bed. The trader's wagon arrived at the northern gate of the Draven Palace complex on a cold Tuesday morning in late autumn, carrying 3 crates of reference materials from the Hollow Valley Archive, 2 bolts of writing cloth for the document office, and 1 young woman sitting in the back between the crates, with a single bag on her lap, and the specific expression of someone who has already made the decision, and is therefore past being nervous about it. Her name was Seraphina Vale. She was 22 years old, and she had been appointed assistant to the Draven Palace's head archivist through a regional civil service process that involved a written examination, a set of professional references from her previous position, and an interview conducted entirely by correspondence, which meant she had never actually been inside the Draven Palace before. This also meant that every piece of information she had about the place she was about to live and work had come to her secondhand, through documents and letters and the regional directory, none of which had managed to adequately communicate the size of the outer courtyard. The wagon driver helped her down from the back of the wagon at the gate. She thanked him, settled her bag on her shoulder, and looked at what was in front of her. The outer courtyard was considerably larger than the directory map suggested. The receiving dock was on the right. The steward's office, the driver had told her, was through the first courtyard, and then left through the covered walkway. She went left. She found the covered walkway exactly where he had said it would be, and went through it. She came out into a second courtyard. The second courtyard had not been mentioned. She stood in it for a moment and assessed. She tried the arch on the south side, and found a storage corridor with no useful exits. She tried the arch on the east side and walked into a linen preparation area, where a woman with her arms full of freshly folded sheets stopped and looked at her, with the expression of someone who has found an unexpected animal in a room where animals do not belong. "The steward's office," Seraphina said. "Left from the covered walkway." The woman redirected her with admirable specificity. Seraphina thanked her and went, memorizing the correct route as she walked. She found the steward's office 9 minutes after passing through the gate, which she considered acceptable for a first attempt in an unfamiliar building. The head steward was a thin, precise man named Aldrich who processed her appointment letter and documentation with the care of someone for whom thoroughness was a personal standard rather than a professional requirement. He confirmed her lodging assignment in the East Lower Building and issued her a bronze access card. He explained, without looking up from the ledger, the restrictions on her access. The upper wing required written authorization in advance. The West Building was the Alpha King's private residence and working offices, and was not accessible to staff without prior arrangement confirmed in writing. The North Terrace was restricted at all hours without exception. He listed other restrictions. He directed her to the full staff handbook, which would be in her room. He recommended she read it before her first morning. Then he looked up and added, not unkindly, "The handbook is thorough. Read all of it." She said she would. A young woman named B showed her to her room, walking quickly and talking at the same pace, answering questions before they were fully asked. The room was on the east side of the lower building, moderate in size, with one window facing the inner yard, a narrow bed, a writing desk, and a wardrobe that smelled of cedar. Seraphina set her bag on the desk and looked around and thought, "This is good, this is workable." She had lived in smaller rooms and in worse-smelling ones, and the desk was solid, which mattered, and the window got the morning light. "You're in the archive?" Bea said from the doorway. "Assistant to the head archivist, starting tomorrow. Hugh. He's very nice. He drinks an enormous amount of tea, and makes these small sounds when something in a document surprises him. Little personal sounds, like each piece of unexpected information is a personal affront. But he is genuinely kind, and he will treat you well." B hesitated, with the look of someone deciding how much to say. "You know where you are, yes? The Draven Palace?" "I know. There's been an atmosphere lately. In the upper wing especially. It doesn't affect the lower staff much directly, but you notice it in the building." She paused again. "You won't be near the upper wing. I have restricted access to the archive and connecting areas." B looked relieved in the specific way of someone who has said what felt important and is glad it landed. She wished Seraphina a good first night and went. Seraphina unpacked methodically. Books on the desk by size. Writing tools in the top drawer, by type. Reference cards in their wooden box in the second drawer. The small framed sketch of her parents' house, which she set on the windowsill where she would see it when she woke. She had carried it from every placement she had worked since she was 16, and it went on the windowsill every time. She read the staff handbook cover to cover. It took an hour and 40 minutes. She folded down one page, underlined 2 passages, and set it on the corner of the desk, where she would remember to reread the underlined sections before the end of the week. She was the kind of person who read handbooks, not because she worried about consequences, but because she preferred to understand the shape of a place before she moved through it. Her parents had died of the river fever when she was 16, 2 weeks apart, which was how the river fever moved that season. The neighbor who had taken her in was a woman called Penn, who managed the regional document office, and who had let Serafina work alongside her in exchange for help with the backlog, which had been considerable. Serafina had turned out to be good at the work, in a way that made the arrangement less of a charity than it initially appeared. 2 years later, Penn had helped her apply for the position in Hollow Valley, and Serafina had gone there and settled in and been effective, and had found the work genuinely satisfying, which she understood was something that not everyone found in their work, and which she did not take for granted. She had applied for the Draven position because it was professionally a step forward, and the work scope was broader, and the pay was better, not because she was brave in any dramatic sense. She was practical. The practical decision was to apply, and she had applied, and here she was in a room in the Lower East building of the Draven Palace, with a good desk and a cedar-smelling wardrobe, and the framed sketch on the windowsill. She went to the staff dining room for supper, and sat at the end of a long table next to a woman from the laundry department, who was pleasant, and talked about the cold weather that was expected later in the week. Serafina ate and listened, and asked 1 or 2 questions, and went back to her room, and fell asleep at a reasonable hour. She was not worried. She was new to the building, and would be for a few weeks, and new things required attention and adjustment. The archive would be good work. Hugh sounded like good company. The food she had now confirmed was as good as its reputation suggested. She could do this. Hugh was exactly what Bea had promised. He was perhaps 55, with the particular appearance of someone who had spent most of his professional life in archive rooms. Not unhealthy, simply indoor in the specific way of a person whose work is also their world. He welcomed Serafina on her first morning with warmth and without condescension, and immediately presented her with an 11-year backlog of misfiled regional tax records. "My previous assistant had her own organizational logic," he said, in the tone of someone who had been selecting words about this for a long time. "I have my own system. They are not compatible. I would be very glad of help making the records workable." Serafina looked at the pile. She looked at the shelf behind it, where the records should have been. She said, "If I start with the earliest years and work forward, reconciling each batch before moving to the next, we'll have a stable foundation, rather than a partially corrected middle." Hugh looked at her with the expression of a man who has been bracing for a long argument about methodology, and has instead been handed the right answer. "That is exactly the right approach," he said. "Please do that." She did. She worked steadily through the morning and then the afternoon, and the archive was 3 connected rooms, with high shelves and good south light from the tall windows, and a back room for the older sealed materials, and she felt immediately comfortable in it, in the way she had always felt comfortable in archive rooms. They made sense to her in a way that was difficult to fully articulate. Everything in them had a place. Everything had a reason for existing. The records were not alive, but they held the traces of things that had been, and there was something in that she found grounding. Hugh made a small, surprised sound at something in the financial records in the next room. She reached for her pen and kept working. She got lost going back from the dining hall at lunch. She turned right instead of left out of the east corridor, and ended up in the copying office, where a copyist named Cam pointed her back the right way. She thanked him. She went. She got lost again 2 days later. She treated this as a navigation problem requiring more data, not a reflection of anything meaningful about herself, and she kept paying attention to the routes until they became familiar. By the end of the first week, she could navigate between the archive, the copying office, the dining hall, and her room without a wrong turn. By the end of the second, she had added the outer courtyard paths and the lower garden route. She was learning the palace the way she learned every new building, by walking it repeatedly, until it stopped requiring active thought and simply became known. She stayed entirely clear of the upper wing. She stayed clear of the west building. She had no reason to approach either, and no inclination to. On the 12th day of her employment, a Friday afternoon, she was returning from the document copying office with a box of completed record requests for Hugh. She was walking the south connecting corridor, which she knew well and was confident about, thinking about the cross-reference problem in the coastal territory ledgers, when she realized she had turned at the wrong point and was in the east long hallway instead. She counted the doors. She had passed 4. Her access covered the first 3. She was past her boundary. She turned around immediately and started back. She would have made it without incident, except that at the exact moment she turned, the heavy door at the far end of the east hallway came open. She felt the change in the air before she saw the door move. A pressure shift, small but immediate, the kind her body registered automatically. She turned her head. The man who came through the door was tall and broad and moving with the rapid, internalized energy of someone working through something difficult in his own mind. He wore dark, plain clothing without insignia, but he held himself with a quality of authority that needed nothing external to communicate it. His hair was dark and slightly disordered. When his eyes came up and found her standing in the middle of his corridor with a box of copying requests, they were a gray so sharp it was nearly silver. Serafina's mind provided the identification very quickly. Alpha King. Wrong corridor. Box of records. She went still. The weight that had arrived in the air when the door opened, that pressure she had felt through the bone of the building on her first days here, the thing that B had called an atmosphere, softened. Not disappeared, shifted into something less acute, less charged, like a held breath slowly released. She said, because silence seemed like a worse choice. I apologize, my lord. I took a wrong turning. I was heading back to the south corridor. He looked at her. The looking lasted somewhat longer than she expected. Then he said, in a voice that was level and not unkind, back the way you came. First left. He walked past her, maintaining a deliberate 3 feet of space between them, and continued down the hallway toward the western door without looking back. She walked back the way she had come. She took the first left. She was, as he had said, in the south connecting corridor. She walked back to the archive. She put Hugh's records on his desk. She sat at her own desk and picked up the coastal territory cross-reference and continued it. She told herself the encounter had been unremarkable, which was accurate. She told herself the shift in the air had been her imagination, which she was less certain of. She told herself that the fact that the most feared man in the kingdom had given her corridor directions in a perfectly reasonable tone of voice was a small and ordinary event that did not require construction of any larger meaning. She was good at being practical about things. She picked up her pen and went back to work, and the afternoon went on around her, and the archive was quiet and warm, and the palace continued its business, and nothing had changed at all. The third week brought a cold snap off the northern mountains, arriving early and with clear intent. The inner courtyards went gray and sharp within 2 days. The last warmth of late autumn stripped out overnight, and the palace staff moved through the corridors in heavier coats with their heads down. The archive window developed a draft from the southeast corner that Serafina resolved by folding a strip of blotting paper and pressing it firmly into the frame. Hugh brought in an extra brazier from storage and positioned it on her side of the room, explaining that the cold came in from that corner and that he ran warmer than average by constitution. She accepted this without argument because she was almost always cold and had no reason to pretend otherwise. She had found her rhythm in the work by the third week, the particular groove of a person who is suited to what they are doing and has been given enough of it to settle into. The 11-year tax record reconciliation was 3/4 resolved. Hugh had begun routing the more complex requests her way, the boundary assessment disputes and the multi-territory cross-references, because she had a facility for holding several competing organizational systems simultaneously, while tracking where they agreed and where they diverged. And he found this genuinely useful, and said so, which she appreciated, because Hugh was not a man who said things he did not mean. On the 18th day of her employment, a gray Wednesday afternoon, the council session in the upper hall went wrong. She did not know this immediately. She knew it the way you knew things in a building you had lived in long enough, through the texture of the air and the particular quality of quiet that descended on the lower corridors between one moment and the next. It was not noise. There was no shouting, no running. It was more like a shift in what the building was carrying, the way a bridge feels different when the weight on it changes. Hugh looked up from his reading. She looked up from the ledger. They regarded each other across the archive room without saying anything. Hugh looked back at his text. She looked back at hers. She was coming back from returning a batch of completed audit records to the document office at 3:30, when she turned the corner into the south connecting corridor and stopped. The Alpha King was standing in the middle of it. Not walking. Standing with the specific stillness of something that has been moving very fast and has become suddenly motionless. He had come from the upper wing. The heavy iron door behind him was still settling back into its frame, the vibration of it barely audible. He had not yet fully arrived in the corridor. He was still somewhere else in his head, still carrying whatever had happened in the upper hall. His eyes, when they found her, were wrong in the specific way she had been learning to read from the building's general atmosphere. The gray was threaded with silver, and the brightness behind it was too much, pressing in the wrong direction. Not fully silver. She had gathered enough from 6 careful weeks of listening to understand what fully silver meant and what not fully silver meant. She stood 6 feet from him. She had been walking with her head down, occupied with the coastal territory cross-reference, and had not paid attention around the corner. And now she was here, and he was here, and the next several seconds would be whatever they would be. She did not move toward him, and she did not step back. She breathed at a regular rate. She did not make herself smaller, and she did not perform comfort either, because performing it was a different thing from actually being it, and the difference was something that people in difficult situations could often detect without knowing they were detecting it. Something changed. The pressure in the air, the weight of it that had been building since before she turned the corner, shifted. Not gradually. Quickly. The way a fever breaks, the way a tide turns. The brightness in his eyes dialed back by degrees she could almost count. The rigidity across his shoulders changed in quality, the held tension becoming something that was still controlled, but differently controlled, not fighting itself quite so hard. He looked at her. She looked back and said simply, "My lord." A greeting, not an apology, because she was in a corridor she was permitted to use and had done nothing wrong. He said nothing for a moment. Then, in a tone that was ordinary in a way she had not expected, "The cold is coming in from the valley." She said, "Yes." The archive had a draft from the southeast corner since Tuesday. He looked at her for one more second. Then he walked past her, the same 3 feet of space as in the east hallway, deliberate and exact, and he continued down the south corridor without looking back. She stood in the empty corridor after he had gone. She was not afraid. This was the thing that was difficult to account for, and that she was honest enough with herself to note rather than explain away. She had been prepared to be afraid, based on every warning she had received in the building's careful indirect language, and fear was not what the past 30 seconds had produced in her. She filed it. She went back to the archive. Ryden had followed the Alpha King out of the upper hall at the distance he maintained after difficult sessions, close enough to intervene if required, far enough to avoid adding pressure to a situation that already had too much of it. He had been doing this long enough that it required no conscious decision. He went where Cale went, at the right distance. He saw the girl in the south corridor. He had seen her 3 times before, once crossing the outer courtyard, once at the south wing delivery entrance, once through the archive room's open door, when he was walking the lower east corridor, and she was inside, working with the specific focused posture of someone who is properly absorbed in something. The new archivist's assistant, 3 weeks in the building, the kind of person who moved through large, complicated spaces without fuss, which was not as common as it should have been. He watched. He watched the Alpha King find her and stop. He watched her go still, and he watched the nature of her stillness, not the managed performance of calm that people put on around Cale, not the controlled breathing and careful stillness of someone suppressing an instinctive response, but the genuine stillness of someone who had found, without effort, exactly the right way to be in that space at that moment. He watched Cale's shoulders. He had been reading those shoulders for 3 years. He knew every variation in them. He knew the difference between the tension of controlling the wolf and the tension of controlling himself, and the difference between both of those and the tension that preceded an incident. He knew what it looked like when the wolf pushed forward, and what it looked like when it stepped back, and what it looked like when it simply stopped, which was the rarest thing. The thing that happened on the East Terrace, in the right wind, and sometimes nowhere at all. In the 30 seconds after the girl went still in the corridor, The wolf stopped. Not stepped back. Stopped. Settled. The shoulders that had been holding something enormous in place shifted into something different, something that still had effort in it, but was not the same effort. The effort of a man choosing how to move, rather than a man fighting what is moving inside him. Ryden stood in the arch of the upper corridor and watched Cale walk past the girl and continue south. He watched the girl stand for a breath, then go back the way she had come. He watched the empty corridor after they had both gone. He went back to his office. He took out the private journal. He wrote the date, the time, what he had observed. He was precise. He kept his own interpretation out of the record, because interpretation required more data than he currently had, and he was not a man who ran ahead of what he could actually demonstrate. He read the entry back. He wrote a single question mark at the bottom of it. He thought about going to Marin. He decided to wait. Cale did not go to the East Terrace that evening. He went instead to the secondary East Chamber, the one he used when the wolf was too close to the surface for the stairs to feel like a manageable distance, and he sat in the chair at the window and looked at the courtyard below and tried to understand what had happened in the south corridor. The council session had been unremarkable in its specific cause. The Harfin delegate had raised a point about the river access timeline that was technically legitimate, and the wolf had begun pushing forward before Cale's mind caught up with what was happening, which was becoming the standard pattern. The wolf identified pressure in a room before he did and responded to it before he could manage the response. He had ended the session early, which was the right call. He had come through the iron door still managing the aftermath of that call. The cost of it, the particular weight of needing to leave a room before you could not trust yourself to stay in it. And the girl had been there. He had almost walked directly into her. She had been standing in his corridor with a box of records and she had gone still, and within seconds, something in the wolf that had been pushing forward with considerable force had simply stopped pushing. He sat in the chair and thought about this for a long time. He thought about the east hallway on her 12th day, the same result, which he had filed as coincidence. Two incidents with the same result was not coincidence in any framework he knew how to work with. He was a man who had built his understanding of the wolf's states through 2 years of careful and often painful observation, and he did not have a category for what had just happened. The wolf was quiet. This was the remarkable thing, the thing underneath all the analysis. The wolf was genuinely quiet. Not the managed quiet of the East Terrace, the deliberate stillness imposed through cold air and effort. This was different. This was the wolf having simply decided, on its own terms and through its own process, that there was nothing in the current situation requiring its attention. He could not remember the last time the wolf had done that. He stayed in the East Chamber chair for several hours. The wolf stayed quiet. He stayed because he was afraid to move and discover that movement broke it, the same instinct that makes a person stay very still when they have something they do not want to lose. Eventually he fell asleep in the chair, his head tilted against the wing of it, and he slept without waking for 4 hours and 30 minutes, which was more than he had slept without interruption in 2 years and 4 months. When he woke before dawn with his neck stiff from the chair, the wolf was still quiet. It would not last through the full morning, but for a few hours it had simply rested, and he sat in the chair in the dark before dawn and was careful not to ask too much of the moment. He thought about the draft in the archive window and her matter-of-fact mention of it, the lack of performance in her. He thought about the way she had said his title, which was a greeting rather than a deflection. He did not know what to do with any of it yet. But for the first time in a very long time, the not knowing felt less like a problem and more like something that was still becoming clear. She learned the palace by walking it, which was her method for every new building she had worked in. Rather than trying to memorize a map all at once, she walked every authorized route repeatedly, until it settled from conscious navigation into something she did without thinking about it. By the end of the first week, she could go from the archive to the dining hall to her room without a wrong turn. By the end of the second, she had added the lower garden path, the outer courtyard loop, the full south connecting corridor from the document office to the receiving area. She noticed, as she learned it, that the palace had the specific quality of a building that had been added to over many generations. The oldest parts had a different density to them, a weight of stone and intention that the newer additions did not replicate, and you could feel the age of the original structure in the way the corridors curved and the way the light came in from the interior windows, at angles that seemed deliberate rather than incidental. Someone had understood light when they built the oldest parts. Someone had known what they were building and why. She liked this building. She had not expected to. She had expected the atmosphere she had been warned about to make the building hostile, and the atmosphere was real. She felt it in the stone, in the way the days had different textures, but the building itself was not hostile. It was simply old and large and carrying something, the way all buildings that had held lives for long enough ended up carrying something. She thought about this sometimes while she was working, the way the building's character was not the same as the current situation within it, the way a place and the things happening in it were distinct layers that could be read separately. She had a general tendency to think about the places she was in as things with their own logic, and this place had considerable logic. Hugh noticed in her second week that she had been late for 2 consecutive mornings in a row, not by much, 10 minutes, and he mentioned it gently. She explained that she had been taking slightly longer routes to the archive as a way of learning the building more thoroughly. He said he understood, and that there was no immediate pressure on the 10 minutes, but she should know that Aldrich tracked attendance for all staff on the upper corridor access list, and it was worth being consistent. She was on time from then on. She simply adjusted her morning departure time to account for the longer route. It was a small thing. It was the kind of small thing that the building required, and she was good at small things. The pattern revealed itself first to Ryden, because he was looking for it. Then to Nora and Bee, because they moved through every part of the lower palace all day, and noticed things that people in fixed positions missed. Then to council members Felix Hart and Owen Blaine, who were professional observers of everything that affected their working relationship with the king. It reached Serafina last, because she was not looking for anything, and because each occurrence, taken individually, had a reasonable explanation she was prepared to accept. The council sessions improved. Not all at once, and not dramatically, but in the specific measurable way of a variable that has changed, and is now producing different results. The sessions ran longer before needing a recess. The atmosphere in the chamber was steadier, the air less charged, the pauses in deliberation less like the pauses that preceded something alarming, and more like the pauses of a man who is thinking carefully before he speaks. The Alpha King's patience in deliberation, which had been one of his defining strengths before the past 2 years, and which had been progressively harder to find beneath the wolf's pressure, came back in degrees, slowly, the way something returns when the conditions for it have been quietly restored. Felix Hart noted this to Owen Blaine in a low, careful voice after one particular session that resolved 3 outstanding territorial questions in a single afternoon, something that had not happened in months. Owen said he had noticed also. Neither of them named it as anything beyond what it appeared to be on the surface. They were experienced enough to understand that naming things too early was how you arrived at the wrong conclusion, and both of them had spent enough years in proximity to the upper wing to understand that wrong conclusions about the Alpha King were not a category of error you recovered from easily. Ryden noted them both noticing. He added a line in the private journal. He had been tracking Serafina Vale's movements through the building for 2 weeks, carefully, without making it apparent, cross-referencing them with the pattern of the Alpha King's days. He was thorough because his role had always required thoroughness, and he was methodical because the alternative was guessing, and guessing about matters involving the Alpha King's wolf was not something he was willing to do. What the cross-reference produced, after 2 weeks of careful observation, was a picture he had suspected after the South Corridor encounter, but had not let himself reach as a conclusion until the data was sufficient. On the days Cale encountered Serafina Vale, in some part of the building, the subsequent hours ran better by every measurement Ryden had. Sessions ran their length. The private incidents he tracked in the journal did not occur. The wolf was quieter in the ways that mattered. On the days there was no encounter, everything returned to the baseline, and the baseline had been declining for months. He wrote this in the journal without interpretation. He wrote question marks. He thought about Marin. He waited. The Alpha King's routes through the palace had changed, and the senior kitchen staff noticed this before anyone else, because their scheduling depended on knowing where he was likely to be. Nora had worked the main kitchen for 11 years. Part of her role was managing the timing of meals and refreshments for the upper wing, which meant knowing the king's general movements through the building on any given day, so that things arrived when they were needed, rather than cold or absent. She had a working map of his standard routes in her head that she had built across years of observation, and she noticed within days of the pattern shifting that the map had changed. He had started using the South Courtyard route. He had not used the South Courtyard route since the previous winter, when the ground conditions had made it the driest path between two specific points, and he had used it out of practicality. Before this autumn, it had not been a route he kept, and yet in the past 4 weeks he had passed through the South Courtyard on 8 separate occasions, at varying hours, without any obvious logistical reason for it. Nora mentioned this to Bea on a Thursday morning, because it was affecting her timing calculations for the afternoon refreshments. Bea said nothing immediately. Then she looked at the small courtyard schedule posted inside the kitchen door, the one that listed which staff took their breaks where, and she said, "The archive girl takes her afternoon break in the South Courtyard when the weather allows." Nora did not comment. She was a woman who had worked in the palace long enough to understand that some observations were not hers to interpret, and that the consequences of interpreting incorrectly in a place like this could be significant. She filed it. She adjusted her timing calculation. She mentioned it to no one else. Bea thought about it for a while and also said nothing, but for different reasons. Serafina had noticed she kept encountering the Alpha King in the building. She had a practical explanation for this ready at hand. She had not yet fully mapped the palace's patterns, and was therefore walking routes that overlapped with his, more often than she intended. She had adjusted her routes twice, trying to identify where the overlaps were occurring, and correct them. The adjustments had not resolved the issue. Over the course of 5 weeks, she had encountered the Alpha King in the South Corridor, the lower east hallway near the document office entrance, the outer court connection passage, and twice in the South Courtyard during her afternoon break. She had not encountered him anywhere near the upper wing, which was the boundary of her access, and she had not initiated any of these encounters, and she had handled each one with the straightforward professionalism that she tried to bring to every workplace situation. On each occasion, he stopped. He said something brief and not unkind, a comment on the weather, an observation about the building's temperature, once a practical question about whether the archive had received the writing cloth shipment it had been waiting on. She answered these things directly. She did not extend the encounters. He walked on. She walked on. She told herself she was navigating a large palace with an unusual traffic pattern and had not yet fully learned it. This was true. It did not fully explain what she was observing, but she did not yet have enough data to say what would. She noticed the weight in the air differently in these encounters than she had expected to, based on everything the building had been telling her about the Alpha King for 6 weeks. She noticed the absence of the specific heaviness that settled over the lower corridors on difficult days in the upper wing. She noticed that she was not afraid in his vicinity, in the way she had prepared herself to be. And she noticed this carefully, because it seemed like relevant information, though she was not yet sure what it was relevant to. She did not talk to Hugh about it. She did not talk to Bea or Nora. She was a person who kept her own counsel in situations she did not yet understand, and she understood very little of this. On a Thursday afternoon in her 5th week, she was in the South Courtyard on her afternoon break. The weather had been clear and cold, and the South Courtyard caught a strip of pale winter sunlight along the bench against the south wall for about 40 minutes around midday. She sat on the bench with a book and her small pot of tea from the kitchen and read, which was what she did when she had 40 minutes and a strip of pale winter sunlight, because she was a person who read when she had the opportunity to. She looked up at some point, and the Alpha King was at the far end of the courtyard. He had come in from the east arch. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the upper buildings, or past them, at the valley, or the sky. He had the expression she had come to recognize as his internal one, the expression of a man working through something in his own mind, present in the space but not fully of it. He stood at the far end of the courtyard. The wolf in him was quiet. She had been arriving at this language slowly, over weeks, without being able to justify the specific terminology, but it was the most accurate description she had for what she noticed, that the quality of stillness around him was different, depending on something she could not see directly. Today the stillness was the easier kind. She looked at her book. She read. She heard him walk the perimeter of the courtyard, unhurried, and then stop near the far wall. After a few minutes, she said, without looking up from the page, "The southwest corner catches the most sun. The wall cuts the wind from the north." A pause. He stopped walking. She kept her eyes on the book. She was not performing indifference. She simply had learned, in the various workplaces and situations of her life, that some people were better helped by things offered without emphasis than by things offered as gestures. and she had said what she said in the same register she would have used to point out a practical feature of the archive room to Hugh. He said, "Thank you." She heard something in his voice she did not have a name for, a small shift in the usual control of it. She glanced up briefly. "Of course," she said, and looked back at her book. She heard him move to the southwest corner. She heard him stay there. She read 2 more pages and finished her tea, and when she looked up again, he was gone. She went back to the archive and told herself she had shared useful information about wind exposure in a courtyard, which was true, and that this was the whole of the encounter, which was less certain. She worked until the light changed and then gathered her things and went to the dining room, and she thought, on the walk, about the strip of winter sunlight and the quiet in a courtyard that had no particular reason to be quiet. She did not think about it again that evening. She was practical. She went to sleep at a practical hour, and woke at a practical time, and went back to work, and the archive was exactly what it always was, and that was enough. Ryden went to Maren the Friday after the courtyard encounter. He had decided to wait until the pattern was beyond reasonable doubt, and it was now beyond reasonable doubt, and he had waited long enough. She was in her chair when he arrived, as she always was, the old wing's thick silence around her. She poured tea for him without being asked, and waited for him to settle. He told her everything. He told it precisely and in order, which took 20 minutes, and during which Maren listened with the complete absence of interruption that she brought to everything she decided deserved full attention. He said, "The wolf does not press when she is present. I've confirmed this across 11 separate encounters in 5 weeks. The days following contact are measurably different from the days without it. The council is noticing without knowing what they are noticing." Maren said, "I know." He looked at her. "You've been watching this." "I've been watching since the day after she arrived," Maren said. "Since I saw the building's atmosphere change the morning after her first corridor encounter with him." She set down her cup. "I've been reading. I wanted to be certain before I said anything, because what I am about to tell you is not something you say prematurely." She stood and went to the shelf behind her chair, and returned with a book, old and dark bound, the leather worn soft with age. She set it on the table between them, and did not open it yet. "There are things about the old bond mechanisms that have not been taught in 2 generations, she said, because the circumstances requiring them had become rare. I had to go back to the oldest texts to find them." She looked at him directly. "Do you want to know now, or do you need a moment?" Ryden said, "Tell me now." She told him. She told him about the scent pathway, and its vulnerability in wolves, of the old lines, that had sustained a bond betrayal. She told him about the stillness mechanism, what the oldest texts called soul frequency. She told him what it meant, that Seraphina Vale was the only person in the building, possibly in the territory, whose presence quieted the Alpha King's wolf, without effort or management. She told him about the dark moon window, 31 days from now, and what the text said happened if the window closed without acknowledgement. She told him everything, and Ryden sat with it, and when she finished, he did not speak for a long time. He said finally, "He cannot know." "No," Maren agreed. "He will remove the variable. He will eliminate his own exposure before it can be used against him. You know him." And she cannot know either. She doesn't know anything yet. She is observing something she doesn't have a framework for, and being very careful and sensible about not drawing conclusions from insufficient data. Maren said this with a quality that was close to approval. Let her continue. The bond is forming whether they understand it or not. Our job is simple. Keep her in the building. Do not let circumstances arise that remove her. The rest has to come from him. Ryden left her rooms and stood in the corridor outside for a long while, counting days. 31 days. One Alpha King who did not know what he was holding. One young woman who simply went to work every morning and did the job well, and took her breaks in the south courtyard when the sun allowed. He went back to his desk. He did not write in the journal. He sat with what he knew, and counted the days, and watched. The official order arrived on a Monday morning, delivered to Hugh's desk in the lower archive by the administrative assistant from the upper wing, a young man named Gareth who served the King's correspondence office, and who held the document delivery with the air of someone carrying something that had surprised him. Hugh read it twice. He set it down. He read it again. He said, "Seraphina." She came from the far room, and read it over his shoulder. The order was brief and formally worded, in the specific language of official palace directives. It stated that, for reasons of administrative efficiency and in recognition of the demands of the current territorial review period, Archive Assistant Serafina Vale was to be reassigned, effective immediately, to the upper floor archive room adjacent to the Alpha King's working offices, which had been prepared for use. Hugh set the paper down very carefully. The upper floor archive room has been used for cold storage for 4 years, he said. The last time it functioned as a working space was during the previous reign. Apparently it has been prepared, Serafina said. He looked at her. He looked at the order. He was a man who had worked in the palace for 18 years, and he understood the language of official orders in both the literal and the deeper sense, and he was currently reading both simultaneously. "You'll still report to me," he said. "Record requests will route to you there, instead of here. For the territorial review documents, there's a case to be made organizationally." He said this in the specific tone of a man making the organizational case, because making it was more useful than the alternative. "I understand," she said. "You are not required to accept the reassignment if you are uncomfortable," he said, and this he said directly, looking at her. "There are positions in the lower archive I can request for you, or I can contact the placement office." She thought about it. She was honest with herself about the thinking. She considered what she knew about the upper wing, which was built from 6 weeks of careful listening, rather than from any direct experience, and she assessed her own response to what she knew, and her response was not fear. She was not afraid. She did not fully understand this, but she did not lie to herself about it either. "I'll go," she said. "Thank you for telling me I could refuse." Hugh nodded. He looked as though he had something else to say, and chose not to say it. He went back to his reading. She collected her things. The upper floor archive room was on the east side of the upper building, 1 door down from the consultation room and 2 doors from what she quickly understood, without being told directly, was the Alpha King's working office. The room was not what she had prepared herself for. She had expected Hugh's cold storage description to mean something dusty and neglected, requiring time and effort before it was usable. What she found instead was a room that had been recently and carefully made ready, shelves dusted, floor swept, the south-facing windows clean, and a desk positioned to catch the morning light from the 2 east windows, solid and well-proportioned with a proper working surface that was significantly better than what she'd had in the lower archive. The chair behind the desk was very good. She sat in it once, briefly, to confirm this, and then stood back up because there was too much else to look at. The reference shelves had been stocked. She moved along them reading spines, and felt something in her chest that she could not immediately categorize. Every text she had been requesting from Hugh for the past 6 weeks, the ones she had been told were unavailable, or in storage, or on loan to the consultation rooms, was here, arranged on the shelves. In the organizational system she had written out for Hugh in her 2nd week, the one she had been using for the coastal boundary reconciliation. Not Hugh's system, her system. She stood at the shelves for a long moment. She filed this observation with the considerable care it deserved. Then she sat down at the excellent desk, opened her working ledger, and started on the territorial review records. She had been in the upper floor archive room for 3 days when the Alpha King came to her door. She was working on the eastern coastal boundary records, making annotations in the margin of the primary assessment document, when she felt the shift in the air from the corridor and looked up. He was standing in the doorway. He was looking at the reference shelves with an expression she could not fully read, and then at the small planning board she had put up on the near wall where she had written out her classification structure for the review materials. He said, "The classification system is wrong." She set down her pen. "In what respect?" "You've built the entire structure around the settlement date precedent. For a territorial review, the current boundary designation is the working document. Settlement dates are reference material. You've ordered them as equivalents." She looked at the board. She looked at him. "Settlement dates establish boundary validity under the Hollow Treaty provisions," she said, "which is the legal standard for this review. The current designation is what the dispute addresses. The settlement date is the evidence that resolves it. They need to be available as a cross-reference, not stored as subordinate." He held her gaze. "I have a separate index for the cross-reference," she said. She opened the top drawer and removed the index sheets and placed them on the desk face up where he could see them. He looked at the index sheets. He looked at the shelves. He said nothing for a moment. Then he went back to his office. The door closed. She put the index sheets back in the drawer and continued the Eastern Coastal annotations. The hot meals began on her 5th day, in the upper floor room. She was working past the dinner hour, absorbed in a set of conflicting Northern Territory claims that required simultaneous attention to 2 land surveys and a historical settlement record, when a quiet knock came at the door. One of the kitchen staff stood with a tray, a bowl of soup, bread still warm, a pot of tea. The girl said, with practiced neutrality, "For the archive." She set the tray on the edge of the desk and left. Serafina ate at her desk without stopping work. The soup was very good. The bread was fresh. She thought, eating, about the shelves arranged in her system, about the excellent chair, about the reference texts that had been unavailable for 6 weeks and were now all here, organized according to her logic, about the tray of hot food that had arrived without being requested and with a justification that explained nothing. She was building a picture from the available information. She was being careful about it, because pictures built too quickly from limited data were unreliable, and she was a person who worked with records and knew what happened when conclusions preceded sufficient evidence. She was going to wait until the picture was clear before she decided what she thought about it. She finished the soup. She went back to the Northern Territory claims. 3 days later, another tray arrived. Different soup, same warmth, same timing, no explanation. He stopped at her door on a Thursday evening at 9:30. She was at her desk with the working map of the coastal and northern territories spread across the wall behind her, the one she had put up herself, annotated in red ink, the notations representing 6 weeks of careful reading and cross-reference work. She looked up when she felt the air shift in the corridor and found him there. He was looking at the map. She waited. He came into the room. He went to the map and indicated, without touching it, a cluster of red notations along the northern river line. "These are transposed," he said, "the tributary and the main channel." She came to stand beside him and looked at where he was pointing. He was right. It was a genuine error, one that would affect 3 of the boundary assessments downstream in her work. She had misread the survey. "You are correct," she said. "I'll fix it tonight." He looked at the map for another moment, reading across the full sweep of it. Then he said, without inflection, without anything that would have allowed her to determine whether it was a compliment or simply a factual statement, "The rest of it is correct." He went back to his office. She stood at the map for a moment after he had gone, looking at the transposed notations. Then she went to her desk and found the original survey and began the correction. She worked until midnight. She thought about the rest of it is correct, and she was honest enough to note that it had landed somewhere in her, the way things land when they mean something, even when you would rather they did not. She was still being practical. She was still being careful. Both of these things were true, and neither of them was the whole of what was happening, and she was going to sit with the discrepancy until she understood it. She corrected the tributary notation. She packed her ledger. She went to her room and lay down in the dark and looked at the ceiling and thought, "The rest of it is correct." She went to sleep eventually. The palace was quiet around her, and somewhere 2 doors down the Alpha King was doing whatever the Alpha King did in his working office at midnight, and neither of them knew yet what they were building, though they were both building it, steadily and without meaning to, the way foundations are built, one careful thing at a time, laid on top of the last, until there is something solid enough to hold the weight of everything that comes after. She thought sometimes, in the evenings when she was working late, about the specific strangeness of the situation she was in, not with alarm, but with the honest attention she gave to things that deserved it. She was an archivist's assistant in the upper wing of a palace that was under a specific kind of pressure, and she was in proximity to the source of that pressure for most of the working day, and she was not afraid. These were facts about her current situation. She held them the way she held facts generally, as information, as data, as things that were telling her something about the shape of the world. The thing they seemed to be telling her was that the situation was not what the warnings had suggested, not exactly. The warnings had been given by people who were describing what the situation looked like from a distance, and from a distance it looked dangerous and unpredictable. Up close, in the actual corridor, at the actual door, it looked different. Not safe exactly. Something more particular than safe. Something that she was still finding the right word for. She was patient with the word-finding process. She did not hurry toward conclusions. She had built a life on the quality of not hurrying toward conclusions, on the understanding that the right understanding came from enough information, given enough time, and that premature conclusion was not understanding at all, but something that only looked like it from a distance. She put more coal in the brazier and went back to the Northern Territory records and worked until the palace grew quiet around her. And when she finally set down her pen and gathered her things, the corridor outside was empty and the building was settled, and she walked back to her room through the quiet upper hall and went to sleep. And in the morning, she got up and went back to work. She was, she noted, quite content. She had not expected to be. She noted this with the same precision she noted everything else, and filed it carefully, and kept going. Elder Marin sent for Beta Ryden on a Friday morning in the first week of November, exactly when she had said she would. He came before the morning briefing, in the particular early morning quiet of the old wing, where the thick walls kept sound from traveling, and the light through the narrow windows was still thin and pale. She was in her chair when he arrived, which was how she was always when he came to her, as though she had been there long before he arrived, and would be there long after. The tea on the side table was fresh. She poured a cup for him without asking, which was also how it always went, and he sat in the chair across from hers, and they looked at each other for a moment in the silence of the old wing. She had a book on the table beside the tea. He had seen it on previous visits. Dark leather binding, the cover soft with age, no legible title from where he sat. He had been curious about it for weeks. Marin said, "I want to tell you a specific thing. I want you to listen to all of it before you respond, because the part that sounds unusual comes before the part that explains what to do about it, and if you stop in the middle you will arrive at the wrong place." He nodded. He was very good at listening to all of something before responding. It was one of the qualities she had identified in him when he was young, and she was paying the kind of attention to the people around the Draven heir that she had always paid to people in positions of proximity to power. She said, "When a wolf of the old lines sustains a break in bond trust, the expected process is gradual recovery, assisted by the mate bond when it forms. The mate bond is identified through matched scent, which is the common understanding, and it is accurate as far as it goes." She paused. She picked up her tea. "What is less commonly known, because the circumstances requiring it have become rare, is that this process does not function the same way in a wolf whose trust has been broken in a particular direction." She spoke precisely and without hurrying. She explained the scent pathway and what happened to it when the trust mechanism was damaged by betrayal. She explained why the wolf shut down the pathway rather than risk being deceived again through it. She explained the 17 documented cases in the book beside her, all of them in old line wolves after bond betrayals, all of them exhibiting the same pattern. She explained what the old texts called the stillness mechanism, the alternative recognition pathway, what they described as soul frequency in the language of their era. Ryden listened without interrupting. When she finished this section, he said, "The wolf recognizes the match by what the match does to its own state, rather than through scent." "Yes. And Seraphina Vale quiets him," Marin said simply, "in a way that nothing else in the building has managed, in a way that is not effort and not performance on her part. The wolf recognizes her. It has recognized her since the first corridor encounter. The bond between them is already forming, whether either of them is aware of it or not." Ryden set down his cup. He had been moving toward this conclusion for weeks, and hearing it stated clearly was a different experience than having arrived at it tentatively on his own. "The dark moon," he said. He had been thinking about the dark moon since Marin first mentioned patterns in their earlier conversations. 31 days from today," she said. She opened the book and turned to the marked page. "The 17 cases in these records are consistent on this point. The stillness bond has a window of acknowledgement. From the moment of first recognition, the bond is forming. If the match is acknowledged before the window closes, if the Alpha King arrives at understanding and acts on it, the bond consolidates and the wolf stabilizes. And if it does not?" She looked at him directly. "A wolf that has found its match through the only remaining pathway available to it, the only mechanism still intact after the scent pathway was shut down by betrayal, and then loses access to that match before the bond consolidates. The wolf experiences this as a second break, a second loss, through the only route it trusted to lead somewhere real." She turned a page in the book. The texts describe what follows as compound breaking, The wolf turns its damage inward. The deterioration becomes permanent. The incidents Ryden has been tracking would cease to be incidents and become the baseline state. He understood what this meant. He did not let himself dwell on the specifics of it. He cannot know, he said. Not a question. He had already worked through the shape of it while she was speaking, because he knew Cale Draven, the way a man knew someone he had spent 3 years watching, handle enormous pressure, and he knew what Cale did with vulnerabilities. If he knows she is the reason for the wolf's stability, that her presence is necessary to him, he will remove her before that necessity can be exploited. He will eliminate it himself before anything else can. Yes, Marin said. He will treat it as exposure and close it. I have been watching him for 30 years, and he has been the same in this respect his entire life. The betrayal only made it more acute. So she cannot know what she is to the wolf either. She does not know. She is observing something she has no framework for, and being sensible and patient about the not knowing. This is actually useful. Let her continue. A pause. She is not in any danger from him. The wolf will not allow harm to come to her, and some part of him already understands this, even if the understanding is not fully conscious yet. What she needs is simply to remain in the building. That's our task, Ryden said. Keep her here. That is the only task, Marin agreed. Everything else has to come from him. He must arrive at the understanding through his own experience of it, without being told what it is. A bond that is explained to someone before they have felt it for themselves does not consolidate the same way. The old texts are clear on this. Ryden sat with this for a moment. 31 days. 31 days. He picked up his tea. He held it. He thought about the gap between the task, which was simple, and the execution of it, which was going to require more nerve than most things he had done in 3 years of serving the Alpha King. Keep her here. Do not interfere. Watch a man who did not know he was walking toward the most important thing in his life, walk toward it on his own time, in his own way, without being pushed. He said, "How confident are you in the texts?" Marin said, "Confident enough that I have not slept well in 2 weeks." He left. He stood in the old wing corridor for a long time after the door closed behind him, listening to the silence of the thick walls. He counted the days on his fingers, though this told him nothing he didn't already know. Then he went back to his office and sat at his desk and looked at the private journal, open to the most recent entry. He did not write anything new. He simply looked at what was already there and understood, for the first time, the full weight of what he had been watching. He watched differently in the days that followed. He had always been watching the wolf's agitation, the building of pressure, the approach to incidents. Now he watched for the opposite. He watched for the moments when the agitation was absent, when the pressure was simply not there, when the Alpha King moved through the building with the particular quality of someone who is not carrying more than he should have to carry. Those moments tracked, without exception, to Serafina. She was in the upper floor archive room now, 2 doors from Cale's working office. They were in the same corridor, the same wing, the same air, for most of the working day. The proximity mattered. Ryden could measure it in the quality of the morning briefings, which had become something he looked forward to rather than dreaded, and in the length of the council sessions, and in the fact that he had now gone 17 days without writing a new incident entry in the private journal. 17 days was the longest gap since he had started keeping the journal. He watched Cale stop at the archive room door in the evenings, sometimes with a pretext and sometimes, increasingly, without one. He watched the girl work with her full attention and respond to the king's occasional presences with the same quality of straightforward steadiness that she brought to everything. No performance, no management, simply herself doing the work and acknowledging his presence the way she acknowledged anything real. He noted the meals being sent up from the kitchen. He noted the reference text that had appeared on her shelves. He noted the excellent desk and the excellent chair and the courtyard corner advice. He watched the dark moon approach, and he counted, and he thought, "We are going to make it." And then Gareth arrived. Alpha Gareth of the Harfin territories arrived at the Draven Palace on a Tuesday, 3 days before the dark moon window closed, with a full diplomatic delegation and the particular ease of a man who had never had significant reason to be uncomfortable anywhere he chose to go. The visit was legitimate. The Harfin territories shared the northern border with the Draven lands, and there were pending resource discussions about the shared riverway management for winter, and the seasonal allocation agreements that needed updating. These were real issues. The visit had been arranged a month earlier. Gareth was a known diplomatic actor, intelligent, accustomed to negotiation, not someone who arrived looking for trouble. He simply did not look very hard for the things he was not looking for. The formal dinner was Tuesday evening. The long table in the East Dining Hall, the good silverware, the fire in the main grate. Ryden attended because he always attended these occasions. He sat 2 positions to the right of the Alpha King, which put him at the near end of the table with a clear view of the room. Felix Hart was across from him. Owen Blaine was 2 seats further down. Gareth sat opposite Cale, with 2 members of his delegation flanking him. The first hour and a half went well. The preliminary river access discussion was productive. Gareth was careful and professional, and spoke about the northern border management with knowledge and precision. Cale responded in kind, which was the version of the dinner Ryden had anticipated. 2 Alpha Kings working through a genuine diplomatic agenda in a functional room. The East Hall had a service corridor that ran behind the east wall, connecting to the kitchen and to the upper annex of the building. It was a staff route, used for deliveries, and for transit between the working parts of the building. It had a brief open section where it crossed the back of the East Dining Hall, screened but not fully concealed, used by staff moving through during the dinner. Serafina was not supposed to be in the East Hall during the dinner. There was no reason for her to be near it. She was the archive assistant. The archive was in the Upper East Wing. What happened was that Gareth's delegation had requested a specific trade record from the consultation room files for the following morning's technical discussion, and someone in the Upper Wing administrative office had asked Serafina to locate and retrieve it, because it was filed in the archive section she managed. She had gone to find it. She had found it, and was carrying it back through the service corridor. She crossed the open section at the wrong moment. The kitchen traffic was ahead of her, and she had moved quickly to avoid blocking the service path, and the timing put her in the open section precisely when Gareth happened to look up from the table. He saw her cross. He took in what he saw with the casual, automatic assessment of a man who noticed things and categorized them without particular thought. He said something to the man beside him in a low voice. Ryden could not hear it from his position, but he saw the man beside Gareth smile, briefly, and he saw the direction of Gareth's gaze. Ryden looked immediately at Cale. The Alpha King was studying the boundary map that had been laid out at his end of the table for reference during the river discussion. He was not looking at Gareth. He did not appear to have looked up. His posture was the same as it had been for the past 20 minutes. Attentive, composed, the controlled engagement he brought to working sessions. Then something changed in it. Not dramatically. The change was subtle enough that anyone who was not Ryden, with 3 years of reading this specific man, would have missed it entirely. The quality of Cale's attention shifted. His head did not come up. His expression did not change. But something behind the composure registered a signal and was processing it, the way a thing that has very good hearing processes a sound before the visible response catches up. His eyes moved to where Gareth had been looking. Serafina was already gone from the open section. She had passed through and continued down the service corridor. What Gareth had seen and commented on to his neighbor was no longer there. Cale looked at Gareth. What followed occupied perhaps 4 seconds. Cale said, in the level, precise voice he used, when something was settled and the conversation was about to reflect that. The resources of this palace are not a topic for commentary of that kind. I believe you understand what I mean. The table went quiet. The specific quiet of a room that has just had its temperature changed without warning. Gareth heard it. He was intelligent enough to hear it, and smart enough to understand that the path that led out of the next few seconds, cleanly, was a short one. He said, "Of course, my lord. My apologies." He said it without elaboration, which was the correct instinct, and he went back to the boundary map. The table came back to itself. Someone said something about the winter river level estimates. The dinner continued. Ryden kept his eyes on Cale for the remainder of the meal. Cale did not look at him. He engaged with the agenda items with the same competence as before, contributed to the river management discussion, reviewed the preliminary agreement language that Felix Hart passed down to him, and said the things that needed to be said in the appropriate order. To anyone who had not been watching closely for the past 6 weeks, he was simply doing his job well, which he was. What Ryden saw beneath the doing his job was a man dealing with the aftermath of having shown, in 4 seconds at a formal diplomatic dinner, Exactly what he did not want anyone at that table to know he was capable of showing. He had corrected Gareth's remark, not because it was diplomatically inappropriate, though it was. He had corrected it because something in him had moved before judgment could catch it, had moved with a speed and a completeness that bypassed the 7 years of governance and management and controlled professionalism that he had built around himself. And that speed and completeness had been visible to everyone at the table, whether they understood what they had seen or not. The dinner concluded without further incident. Gareth's delegation retired to their guest quarters. The council members dispersed. Ryden went back to his office and sat at his desk in the lamplight and thought about what he had watched and what it meant in the context of what Marin had told him and what was going to happen in the next 3 days. And he was still sitting there when he heard, through the connecting corridor, the sound of the Alpha King going to the archive room. He heard the door. He heard the low, controlled conversation that was not quite audible through the walls. He heard the door again. He sat and waited. He did not know what had happened in that room. He knew that Cale had gone there, and he knew why Cale had gone there even if Cale did not know why, and he knew what it meant that the anger at himself had needed somewhere to go, and the archive room had been where he went. He knew all of this, and he sat in his office and waited, and hoped that whatever had been said in the archive room had not moved the situation past the place where it could be recovered. She was at her desk when she heard him in the corridor. She heard the quality of the step before she heard his step, specifically. Something heavier in it than usual, something with more movement behind it, and she set down her pen, because she knew, without looking up, that this was not an evening visit with a pretext. He came in. He stood in front of the reference shelves. He did not look at her immediately. He looked at the shelves and then at the planning board on the wall, and she waited, because she had learned that he arrived at what he meant to say by way of other things sometimes, and pushing the pace of that arrival did not help. He said, "The classification structure is built around an argument that may not hold through the full review period. If the Harfin delegation challenges the Hollow Treaty standard tomorrow, the entire filing logic becomes unstable." She said, "The Hollow Treaty standard is established in 60 years of application. It won't be successfully challenged in a single morning session. You are not a legal expert." "No," she said, "but I have read the relevant precedents, and so have you, and you know I'm right about this." He looked at the map. He looked at the shelves. He said, "The scope of what you've done here goes beyond the original task." She waited. "You have made organizational decisions that should have been reviewed. Your role is assistant, not architect." She looked at him. She let him finish. When he finished, she said, "Yes, my lord." She said it simply, without anger, without the specific flatness of controlled anger either. She simply said it. He held her gaze for one moment, and there was something in his eyes that was not what his words were, a gap between them that she could see plainly, and that she was going to take note of but not speak to, because it was not hers to speak to. He said, "You should remember that this position has a defined end date. The territorial review concludes in the spring. This is temporary." She said, "I know." He went back to his office. She sat at her desk for a long time. The lamp was on, the map was on the wall. The shelves she had organized were full of the correct texts in the correct order. She sat and looked at her desk, and was very precise with herself about what had just happened, because precision was what she had, and she was going to use it. She opened the bottom drawer of the desk. She took out the small crate she had used to carry her personal things when she moved from the lower archive. She had never fully unpacked it. There had been no need, with the desk large and the shelves available, and most of her personal items were already in it still. She added the ones that were not, the pen set, the reference cards in their box, the notebook with her working notes, and the framed sketch of her parents' house from the windowsill. She wrapped the sketch in the cloth she used for protecting documents. She was not angry. She was something quieter than anger, and more deliberate, the feeling of a person who has received clear information and is making a clear decision based on it. She had understood, listening to him, that the words were not about the archive. She had understood this completely, and understanding it did not change what the words had said or what she was going to do about them. She put the crate on the corner of the desk. She went to her room. She sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a time, and thought about what was practical, and what the right thing to do was, and whether those were the same. They were. She would write the letter in the morning. She wrote the resignation letter before first light on a Wednesday morning. She sat at the desk in her room, with the small oil lamp turned up as far as it would go, and she wrote it in the clean, precise hand she used for formal documents, because this was a formal document, and she treated it accordingly. 1 page, addressed to Aldrich in the steward's office. Appropriate notice period of 10 working days, as specified in her contract. Formal expression of professional gratitude for the opportunity, signed with her full name. Brief, specific, and complete. She folded it in thirds. She sealed it with the small wax seal she kept for formal correspondence. She addressed it to Aldrich. She dressed, which took 5 minutes because she had been neat and organized when she unpacked and remained so. She picked up the letter. She went downstairs. The steward's office door was still dark under the frame when she arrived. His hours did not begin until 7. She slid the letter under the door, heard it clear the frame, went back upstairs. She went to the upper floor archive room because she still had work to do. The handover document needed to be written, and it needed to be thorough enough that whoever came next could find anything they needed without difficulty. She had built a good system here. The least she could do was make sure it continued to work after she was gone. She opened the handover template she kept in the second drawer, the one she had prepared in the first week as a matter of professional habit, and she began filling it in. The filing system, documented in full. The classification structure for the territorial review, with the index explained and the cross-reference logic written out. The status of every outstanding record request, each one noted with its current position in her workflow, and the next steps required. The location of every document she had reorganized, with the old location noted alongside the new one so that nothing would be lost in the transition. She worked steadily, and without hurrying. She had a lot to document. She had built a lot in 6 weeks. At 7:43 in the morning, Aldrich arrived at his office. He saw the sealed letter on the floor inside the door. He picked it up, noted the address on it was his, broke the seal, and read it. He read it twice. He went immediately to find Beta Ryden. Ryden was in his office going through the morning briefing preparation when Aldrich arrived with the letter. He handed it over without preamble. Ryden read it. He read it again. He kept his expression controlled and his breathing even, which cost him something, and he handed the letter back to Aldrich and said he would handle it. Aldrich went back to his office. Ryden sat at his desk for a moment. He ran the calculation quickly and with full attention. 3 days to the dark moon window closing. The bond not yet acknowledged. Seraphina Vale in the process of leaving the building. The wolf operating, at this moment, with the stabilizing effect of her presence in the upper wing, unaware of what the letter on Aldrich's floor meant for the next several days. He did not let himself think about the compound breaking. He had read the passage Marin showed him twice, and he had not read it again, because reading it a third time would not change its contents and would not help him think more clearly. He took the letter and went to the upper wing. He knocked on the Alpha King's working office door. He went in. Cale was at his desk. He looked up. Ryden walked to the desk and set the letter on it. He said, "Read this." Cale looked at the letter. He looked at Ryden. He picked it up and read it. The room was very still for a long time. Ryden watched the Alpha King read a 1-page letter and watched the moment when the reading ended and the second moment, immediately after, when what was in the letter moved through whatever was in Cale's mind and landed somewhere, and the landing showed, briefly, completely unguarded, in the set of his face and the quality of his stillness. It was not what Cale's face usually showed. It was not the measured response or the controlled professional register. It was something underneath those things, something that rarely if ever came to the surface, and it was there for the space of perhaps 3 seconds, before everything that had been learned over 31 years came down over it. The wolf responded. Ryden felt it in the room, the pressure he had been tracking for months but sharper now, directed. A wolf that had identified something it did not want to happen and was producing a response to it. Not outward, inward. The wolf pressing against the situation from the inside. Cale set the letter on his desk. Ryden said, before Cale could speak, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear all of it." A silence. Then, "Say it." "What I'm about to tell you," Ryden said carefully, "I should have told you sooner. I was following Marin's guidance, and her guidance was correct at the time it was given, but the situation has changed, and I am telling you now, because I do not have the option of waiting any longer." He told him. He told him about the old bond mechanisms. He told him about the scent pathway, and the trust break, and what happened to old line wolves in this specific circumstance. He told him about the stillness mechanism in the way Marin had explained it, and he told him what that mechanism meant in the context of everything he had been observing for 6 weeks. What it meant that the archive assistant was the only presence in the building that quieted the wolf without effort or management. He told him about the dark moon window 3 days from now, and what the old text said about the window closing without acknowledgement. He said all of it plainly and without softening it. When he finished, the room was very quiet. Cale turned to the window. He stood with his back to the room, looking at the courtyard below, and the wolf in him was doing something Ryden had never seen it do. It was not pressing forward, and it was not retreating. It was simply present, fully present, with what was happening, in the way something stands when it has finally been given the information it has been waiting for. 3 days, Cale said. 3 days. Another silence. Ryden watched his shoulders, and understood, through the reading of them he had done across 3 years, that what was happening right now was not the response to a strategic situation. It was something else. The thing beneath the strategy. The thing that the strategy had been built to protect. "She's still in the building?" Cale said. "In the upper archive room. She's writing the handover document." A muscle moved in his jaw. He said, "Bring her to me." Ryden said, "No." Cale turned around. "If she comes because I brought her," Ryden said, holding the gaze, "it solves nothing. She will understand why she was brought, and it will mean nothing to her, beyond obligation. And obligation is not what you need, and it is not what the wolf needs, and it is not what she deserves." A pause. "You know her well enough by now to know that. She is not going to stay because she was sent for. She is going to stay because she chooses to, which means the reason for the choice has to come from you." The room was very quiet. The Alpha King looked at him for a long moment. Ryden stood where he was, and did not look away, and did not soften it, because the time for softening things was done. Then Cale went to the connecting door to his private rooms, and Ryden heard, after a moment, the sound of him changing his coat. He came back through. He was wearing something without insignia, something plain. He did not pick up any of the things that usually came with him when he left the office. He said, "Don't send anyone after me." He went out. Ryden stood in the empty working office for a moment. He stood at the window and watched the courtyard below, and thought about what he had set in motion, and whether he had done the right things in the right order. He thought about Marin's 31 days, and about the 3 that were left. He thought about a young woman in the upper archive room, writing a handover document with the same thoroughness she brought to everything. He went to find Marin. She was already in the corridor outside his office when he got there, which meant she had heard something, or felt something, or done what she sometimes seemed to do, which was simply no. She looked at him and said, "He's gone to the gate." "Yes." "Alone?" "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the window at the end of the corridor, and the pale November light coming through it, and she said, "Good." He looked at her. "You knew this was coming." "I knew something like this was coming," she said. "I did not know whether it would happen on day 31 or day 3. I hoped it would happen before the window." Ryden said, "What if she says no?" Marin looked at him, with the expression of someone who has been thinking carefully about a question for a long time. "Then," she said, "he will have to be the kind of man who asks better." She went back to the old wing. Ryden stayed at the window and watched the outer courtyard and waited, and the palace moved around him in the ordinary business of a Wednesday morning, and somewhere outside the northern gate, the most important conversation of the Alpha King's life was beginning, and there was nothing to do about any of it now, except wait, and trust the thing that was already happening. He was not good at waiting when the stakes were this high. He waited anyway. She was sitting on the low stone wall beside the northern gate when he found her, her single bag at her feet, her face toward the mountains in the east, where the sky was the pale, flat gray of a November day that has not decided what it wants to do. She was not performing composure. She was simply composed, which was different, and he stood inside the gate for a moment before she became aware of him, and in that moment, he looked at her and understood, clearly and without room for argument, that she had known this might come, and had prepared herself for it, and had decided what she was going to do, and was simply doing it with the quiet efficiency she brought to everything. The bag was practical size. The crate he had heard about was not with her. which meant she had left it in her room, which meant she had not sent it ahead, but had also not yet committed to taking it. He noticed this. He filed it. She heard him then, and turned her head. She saw him, and looked at him for a moment, without changing her expression. She said, "My lord." He came through the gate. He walked across the 12 feet of packed earth between the gate and the wall, and stopped in front of her. He had not brought anyone. He was in a plain dark coat, with no insignia, no ring, nothing that marked what he was, except the way he held himself, which was the one thing he could not take off. She waited. He said, "You're waiting for the noon cart." "Yes." "The Hollow Valley cart." "Yes." "The placement office in Hollow Valley confirmed they have a position. I wrote to them last week." She paused. "Some time ago." He heard the correction. He heard when the correction would have come from. He filed this too, in the place he was filing everything he observed about her, the careful accumulating record of a person he had been watching for 11 weeks, and was only now, in the cold November morning at a gate with no guards and no strategy, beginning to understand he had been watching because he could not stop. He said, "I want you to stay." She looked at him. She said, "Ryden found me in the archive room this morning. He told me the king wanted to speak with me." "What did he say exactly?" "That you wanted to see me. That I should come to the upper wing." She looked at her hands in her lap. "I chose the gate instead." He had known she would. He had not sent Ryden back with a second message because he had known that a second message was not what this required. She was a person who moved toward what she chose and away from what she did not. And the note and the handover document and the bag at the wall were a choice she had already made, and he was going to have to give her a reason to make a different one. He said, "Can I tell you something?" She said, "Yes." He had thought, on the walk from the palace to the gate, that he would plan what he said. He had tried to plan it, and had found that planning it produced a version of the thing he was trying to say that was not actually the thing, and that the not actually the thing version was exactly what had gotten them both to this gate on this Wednesday morning, and he was done with that version. He said, "My wolf has been broken for 2 years and 6 months." She was still. She was listening, in the complete way he had come to recognize in her, the way that gave whatever was being said its full due. He told her about it. He told her what the wolf's damage had cost him, what the 2 years of sleeplessness and management, and the incidents, and the shrinking territory of what he could manage without the wolf responding, had felt like from the inside, not from the formal position of an alpha king with a problem being addressed by healers and elders, but from the inside of the thing, where it lived. He had not described this to anyone. He was describing it now, because the alternative was not describing it, and he had already tried that, and it had produced a woman sitting on a wall with a bag at her feet. He said, "On the 18th day, you were in this building. I came out of a council session and turned a corner, and you were standing in the south corridor." She waited. He said, "The wolf went quiet, not because I managed it, not because I did anything. It simply went quiet, the way it goes quiet when I stand on the east terrace in the right wind, but faster than that, and different from that, and I didn't understand it, and I filed it as a coincidence and kept going." He paused. "It was not a coincidence. I know that now. I have known it for some time, and I have been making other decisions about what to do with that knowledge." She said nothing. She was looking at him. "I moved your archive room because the lower building was too far," he said. "I put the reference texts on the shelves, because you had requested them 3 times, and they were available, and it was practical. I sent the meals, because you worked late, and you did not stop to eat, and He stopped. He chose not to qualify this. "I sent the meals, because I was aware that you had not eaten, and I did not want that. I walked the south courtyard in November because you were in it. I stopped pretending any of this was about the archive records sometime around the end of October, and I kept doing it anyway, because the wolf was quieter when you were near, and I did not want to give that up, and I did not know what else to do with that information, except continue toward it." He stopped there. He let it stand. She said, "You told me the position was temporary." "Yes." "You told me my organizational decisions exceeded my role." "Yes." "You told me the classification structure was wrong, which you knew was not true." He said, "Yes." She looked at the mountains. He stood and let her look. The trader's cart from the south was due at noon, and the road was still empty, and the light was the pale flat light of a cold morning, with everything still to be decided. She looked back at him. She said, "You did all of that because you were afraid of what it meant." It was not a question. He said, "Yes. I know," she said. She said it simply, without accusation, and without forgiveness either. The way you state a thing you have already established to be true. I knew that when you were saying it. It did not make it easier to hear. "I know," he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then, "What are you actually asking me?" He held her gaze, and he did not reach for the managed version of the answer, the one that gave him somewhere to stand if it went wrong. He said, "I am asking you to stay, not because of the archive. Not because of the territorial review. Because without you in this building the wolf goes back to what it was for 2 years. And I have been living with what it was for 2 years. And I know now what the difference is. And I do not want to go back to that." He stopped. He looked at her face. He said the honest thing, the one with nothing around it, "Because I do not want you to go." She looked at him for a long time. The wind came off the mountains and moved between them, cold and steady. She said, "Say it again." The same words in the same order, and no pause before them this time, and no qualification after, because there was nothing to qualify, and he was done with qualifications. The sound of the noon cart reached them from around the bend in the road. The driver would be visible in a few minutes. She looked at the road, she looked at him. She looked at the road again for a moment, which he understood was not doubt but thought, and he stood in the cold and waited, and did not fill the waiting with anything, because there was nothing he could add to it now that would be better than what he had already said. She stood up from the wall. He went very still. She reached down and picked up her bag. She held it for a moment. Then she turned to him and held it out. He looked at the bag. He looked at her face. She said, "I am not staying because you need me to." He said, "I know." She said, "I am staying because I want to know who you are when you are not afraid of it." He took the bag. The cart came around the bend and rolled past them toward the palace gate without stopping. The driver did not look at them, which was appropriate. They stood in the road while the cart went past, and then they walked back through the northern gate together, and the wolf inside him was the quietest it had been in 2 years and 6 months, and the day was cold and pale and the mountains were still to the east, and they went back the way he had come, together, and this time there was no distance between where he was and what he wanted. He had the bag in his hand. He held it carefully. The reinstatement document was handled by Aldrich before the afternoon was over. He processed it with the same careful, unhurried thoroughness he brought to everything that crossed his desk. Full name, dates, role confirmation, access restoration. He printed 2 copies, gave one to Serafina, filed the other. He looked at her as she signed it, and said, in the tone of someone who is departing from their usual professional register by considered choice, "I am glad you have returned, Miss Vale." She said thank you, and she meant it, and she went back to the upper wing. Her quarters had changed. This was done while she was in the steward's office, which meant it had been organized quickly and with specific direction, because the room she walked into on the upper floor of the east wing was not the room she had occupied for the past 6 weeks. It was considerably larger, with 2 south-facing windows that caught the afternoon light, and a view from both of them across the lower courtyard to the beginning of the valley, the mountains visible beyond. The furniture was better. The desk was the same quality as the one in the archive room, which was to say, it was very good. Her crate was on the desk. Someone had carried it from the archive room. The framed sketch of her parents' house was on the windowsill, which she had not done herself. She stood and looked at the sketch for a moment. She thought about her mother and her father and what they would have made of this building, this situation, this Wednesday in November. She thought her mother would have asked about the food first, and her father would have asked about the books. She thought her father would have found the territorial review genuinely interesting. She unpacked the crate properly this time. Everything had a place. She put everything in it. Nora saw them come back through the northern gate, because she happened to be crossing the outer courtyard at the time, carrying a basket of late-season herbs from the lower kitchen garden. She saw the Alpha King walking back from the direction of the northern gate, and then she saw that he was not alone, and then she saw that the archive girl was beside him, and then she saw that he was carrying her bag. She stood in the outer courtyard, and watched them cross toward the east wing entrance. She waited until they had gone through. Then she went to the kitchen and put down the herbs, and went to find B. B was in the staff corridor near the laundry. Nora said, "He carried her bag back through the northern gate." Bea looked at her. Nora said, "He came to the gate himself. He was alone. He walked her back and he carried her bag." Bea sat down on the bench in the staff corridor. She sat there for a moment and then she said, "Well?" Nora said, "I know." They sat with this for a moment in the way of two people who have been in a building long enough to understand the weight of specific things. By the evening meal, the information had traveled through the kitchen, the laundry, the document copying office, and the lower corridor staff. By the following morning, it had reached the upper wing by the careful, indirect channel that things traveled when people understood that directness was not always available to them. By midday, the consensus across the palace was clear. The Alpha King had gone alone to the northern gate to bring back the archive girl who had resigned, and he had carried her bag, and there was no version of that story that was not significant. The interpretation of its significance varied by department, but the weight of it was universal. It was the weight of a thing that had shifted, in a place that had been waiting for something to shift, and now that it had shifted, the building itself seemed to breathe differently. In the old wing, Merrin told Ryden what he needed to hear. She told him that the Dark Moon window had been met. She told him that the bond was acknowledged and consolidating, and that the compound breaking was no longer a risk they needed to hold against. She told him what this meant for the Wolf, and what it meant for the Alpha King, and what it meant for the Pack, in practical terms over the months that would follow. Ryden listened to all of it. When she finished, he said, "How long for the Wolf to be fully stable?" "Months," Merrin said. "A season, perhaps. These bonds take time to build into what they are meant to be. But the worst is behind it. The Wolf has found its ground. It will not lose it now." He nodded. He had been holding something at a careful distance for weeks. A specific weight he had been managing the way he managed most difficult things, by keeping it slightly at arm's length, by tracking the situation rather than living in the anxiety of it, by doing the next right thing rather than dwelling on what would happen if the next right thing was not enough. He let go of it now. He let it go completely. He let out a slow breath. Merrin looked at him with affection that was the kind that existed between people who have worked hard at something together for a long time. She said, "You held the line well." He said, "I followed your instructions." She said, "You followed them when they were very difficult to follow, which is not the same as simply following them." He accepted this. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "How long before he understands the full depth of what she is to him?" Merrin said, "He will understand it over time. It is not a single understanding. It is many." "How long before she understands the full depth of what she is to him?" Merrin looked at him with the expression of someone who has thought about this more than he has. "She may understand it faster than he does," she said. "She is a very precise person. She is already paying close attention. She is building the picture with the information she has. By the time he is ready to show her the whole of it, I think she will have already arrived at it." Ryden thought about this. He thought about the archive girl in the south courtyard on a cold morning, pointing out the warm corner without looking up from her book. He thought about her standing in a corridor and not moving. He thought about her sitting on the wall at the northern gate with her bag at her feet and handing it over when the moment came. He said, "She already knows, doesn't she?" Merrin's smile was small and certain. "She knew before the gate," she said. "She has been deciding what to do with knowing." The Dark Moon came and went on a Friday night, unremarked in the palace at large. Merrin noted it. Ryden noted it. Kale, in his east chamber, noticed the moonless sky from his window, thought briefly about everything that had been writing on the window, and everything that had happened in the time it took the window to close, and then went to bed and slept through the night. The Wolf did not wake him. This had not been true in 2 years and 4 months, and was now simply what happened. He slept. He woke rested. He went through the morning with the specific quality of a man who has not been fighting himself in the night, and therefore has more of himself available in the day. It was not the same as before the Hollow Treaty. It was not the complete easy partnership that had existed in the first years of his reign. That particular thing was gone, and he was honest enough with himself to understand that it was gone, and to understand also that what had replaced it was something different but not less, something steadier, something that had been earned through a longer and harder path, and therefore knew its own ground more thoroughly. He found he did not miss the old version as much as he had expected to. He stopped pretending his visits to the archive room had operational purposes in the third week of December. He had been pretending since she came back. He had been arriving with documents that needed archival attention, or questions about the review record status, or observations about the organizational system. These things were true in the sense that they were real documents with real questions, but they were not why he came. And at some point in the third week, he arrived at her door, at 8:30 in the evening, with a report in his hand, and she looked up from her work, and he said, "I do not have a reason tonight. I have a report, but that is not the reason." She looked at him for a moment, then she said, "Sit down then." He sat in the visitor's chair. He worked through the report, which genuinely needed attention. She worked on the winter allocation records she had been reconciling. The brazier in the corner made small sounds. Her pen made the specific small sound of careful, fast handwriting. The lamp on the desk spread a circle of warm light across the map on the wall behind her. After a while, he set the report down and looked at the map and thought about the fact that the past 3 weeks had been the steadiest of the past 2.5 years, and that he had not added an entry to the incident log in so long that he had stopped thinking about it, and that the council sessions were being described by Felix Hart as productive, which was not a word Felix Hart had used for them in some time. He said, "Serafina." She looked up. "The East Garden or the South Terrace," he said. "In the spring. For afternoon breaks. The East Garden gets better light from mid-morning. The South Terrace has better wind protection." She looked at him for a moment. Her expression had something in it he could not name exactly, something warm, something that had a texture to it, the kind of look that meant the thing being asked was understood as more than it was literally. She said, "The East Garden." He said, "The East Garden." She held his gaze for one moment longer, with the look that meant she had heard all of it, and then she went back to the winter allocation records. He went back to the report. The room was warm and quiet, and outside the winter dark had settled over the valley, and neither of them said anything more that evening, and neither of them needed to. The East Garden in December was stripped down to its bones. The beds were bare, cut back for winter, and the stone paths between them were cold and dry, and the permanent structures of the garden, the low walls, the shaped borders, the geometry of what had been planted, and what would grow again, were visible in a way they were not when everything was in full season. She walked it on a gray, late December afternoon, when the archive work was finished and the light was still enough to see by. She walked the paths and looked at the structures and thought about what the garden would be in the spring when it came back, and about the east light that came in over the south wall from mid-morning, and about a specific question asked in a warm archive room in December that was not quite about a garden. She was thinking about this when she heard boots on the path behind her. She did not turn immediately. She let him catch up. He came to walk beside her, matching her pace with the specific adjustment she had noticed at the northern gate. From slightly behind to beside, a deliberate correction, measured and conscious. She had filed this away when it happened at the gate, and she had filed it again now. They walked the perimeter of the East Garden in the December quiet. The bare structures of the beds rose around them on either side. The south wall cut the worst of the cold from the north. At the eastern end, the sky above the wall was the soft, colorless blue of a winter afternoon, when the light is still there, but the warmth has already left. She said, "It will be good in spring." He said, "Yes." They walked back along the north side. She looked at the bare beds and thought about what would come back in them when the season turned, and she thought about what was already here, in the plain, cold truth of a garden that had shown her its bones, and she thought there was something honest about this that she liked, this version that did not hide anything. He walked beside her, and the wolf inside him was at peace, genuinely and fully at peace, in the way she would come to understand over time, meant that something permanent had settled. She was not afraid of the understanding. She had been moving toward it for weeks, carefully, with the patience and precision she brought to anything worth understanding, and she was nearly there. She was not going to rush the last part. Some things were worth arriving at in their own time. The garden held the gray winter light between them. The mountains were still and cold to the east. The palace rose behind them, old stone, the same stone it had always been, holding the same warmth in its walls against the same cold outside. And if the two people walking the East Garden path were slightly closer to each other than they had been at the beginning of the walk, neither of them remarked on it, because some things did not require remark. They walked. And the wolf was quiet. and the afternoon held, and somewhere in the old wing, Marin sat in her chair with her tea and her book, and was satisfied with how things had gone. And somewhere in his office, Ryden wrote the last entry in the private journal. The Alpha King walked the East Garden this evening with the archive girl, and the wolf did not stir, and the palace is at peace. He closed the journal. He put it in the drawer. He did not lock it. There was nothing in it anymore that needed protecting. In the long run of that winter, those who had been in the council chamber that afternoon would remember not the sound of the incident, or the sight of the open window, but the quality of the silence that followed. The silence after the doors closed behind the king, the way the remaining council members looked at each other, and the way no one said anything, and then slowly and very carefully went back to their papers, and the way each of them chose, in the days and weeks that followed, to write in their notes that the session had concluded early, due to scheduling pressures, rather than to write the thing that was actually true. It was not dishonesty. It was the instinct that people who worked close to the fire developed, the instinct for understanding which truths were useful to record, and which truths were the kind that, written down, became something that could not be controlled. Ryden understood this. He understood it, and worked within it, and had been working within it for 3 years. There were things in the private journal that he would not have put in an official record, and things in his own mind that he had not put in the journal. And the space between those layers was where most of the actual business of his role was conducted. He understood also that this could not continue indefinitely. He had understood this for some time, in the clear, methodical way he understood most things, without urgency, but without pretending the understanding was not there. Something had to change. He did not know what it would be. He kept his attention wide and his expectations loose, and he watched, which was what he had. The Draven territories extended across 7 distinct pack regions, from the northern mountain passes where the Harfin border ran along the ridgeline, south to the river delta, where 3 separate pack lines had been managing a shared water agreement for 60 years. The east to the forest territories, where the wolves ran older and wilder, and had a different relationship to formal governance than the settled packs of the central regions, and west to the coast, where the sea-facing communities had developed their own distinct culture, that was Draven, by affiliation, and something else entirely by practice. Governing this range required an understanding not just of law, but of character, the specific character of each territory and each community within it. And Cale had spent 7 years building that understanding through direct engagement rather than through reports. This was one of the things that made the current situation particularly costly. He could not govern at the distance that managing the wolf would have required. He had to be present, in rooms, with people, with the accumulated pressures of those rooms and those people, and the wolf responded to pressure the way it had been responding for 2 years, which was not ideally. He managed it, because managing it was the job. He managed it, and he kept going, and he was very tired. This was not something he said aloud. He had said it once, to himself, in the East Chamber, very late on a night, in the 2nd year, when the wolf had been particularly difficult, and he had gotten up and stood at the window, rather than fight for sleep any longer. He had said, "I am very tired." He had said it to the dark window and the empty room and the valley below, and then he had gone back to bed and gotten up in the morning and gone to work. He did not say it again after that, but he knew it was true, and the knowing of it was something he carried in the same way he carried the wolf's pressure, quietly, completely, without letting it show. The arch of the south corridor, where she had been standing with her box of copying requests when the incident happened, was one of several turning points in the lower east building, where the stone curved, and the light came in from the interior windows, at an angle that made the space feel wider than it was. She had noticed this quality of the space in her first weeks in the building, when she had been learning her roots and paying attention to the details of the architecture as a way of memorizing it. The palace was old, older than the 7 generations of Draven kings that the records in the archive covered, and its oldest parts had a quality of mass and intention that the newer additions did not fully replicate, a sense that the stone had been placed with an understanding of light and weight and the way space felt to people moving through it. She had noticed that the wolf, in those encounters in the corridors, was different from the wolf she registered through the building's general atmosphere. The building's atmosphere was a diffused thing, not focused, a general weight that varied by day and by what was happening in the upper wing. In the corridor encounters, the thing she registered was focused, present, directed in the specific way of something that has found a point of attention. She had not done anything about this observation because she had no category for it, and she was not in the habit of constructing categories before she had sufficient data. She had simply noted it, and continued to note it, and waited for more information. More information was coming, she suspected. She was patient. Serafina Vale had lived in 4 different places since she was 16, not counting the brief weeks between positions that she had spent with Penn in the document office, which had been a constant she could return to, rather than a placement in the usual sense. She had learned something from each of the 4 positions that was not written in any professional handbook, that the specific character of a place was best understood, not from the documents it produced, but from the patterns of the people within it, the rhythms they fell into without thinking, the things they did when they were at ease versus when they were managing something. The way the atmosphere of a building could tell you more about what it held than any official account would. The Draven Palace had a specific character that she had been reading since her first day. The character was defined by its central fact, which was that the building held something that required careful management at all times, something that everyone in the building was aware of, and most of them could not name directly, something that affected the texture of every interaction and the temperature of every corridor in ways that were not linear, but that were consistent enough to read. She had been reading it for 6 weeks. What she had read told her, this is a building under continuous significant pressure. The pressure is not external. It comes from inside the upper wing, and it moves through the building the way temperature moves, from the source outward, changing the quality of everything it touches. The people in the building have adapted to this, the way people adapt to any persistent condition, by building their lives around it, by knowing which rooms to avoid on which days, by learning to read the subtle signals that told you whether the current moment was manageable or required different handling. She had not been afraid of this. She found this noteworthy. She had a functional relationship with her own fears. She knew what she was afraid of, and she treated those things with appropriate caution. And not being afraid of something she had been warned about repeatedly was information she did not dismiss. She thought about this sometimes in the late evenings when she was still working and the upper wing was quiet. She thought about what it meant that she was not afraid. She thought about the south courtyard and the weight that was simply absent there, the quality of ease that should not have been possible given everything the building told her about the source of the pressure. She was building something, she understood. She was building understanding. She was patient with the building process because the thing she was trying to understand was complex, and the data was still coming in. She went back to work. The records were excellent company. Hugh was kind. The archive room in the evenings was warm and quiet and exactly what she needed. She was, on balance, all right. This surprised her a little, and she was honest with herself about the surprise. She had expected difficulty here, of the specific kind that all the warnings had been describing, and instead, she had found something she had not expected. The particular complicated piece of a person who is in the right place, even if they cannot yet say exactly why. The old texts Marin had been consulting were not widely known. They had been copied once, in the era when such things were copied, by a scholar of the Pack histories who understood that certain knowledge was too specific to be broadly distributed and too valuable to be lost. They had lived in the Draven archive for 4 generations, in the sealed materials room at the back of the lower archive, where Hugh kept the things that required controlled access, and they had been consulted perhaps 6 times in the past century. Marin had read them when she was young, when she was first apprenticing in the role of Pack Elder, and was reading everything she could find on the old bond mechanisms. She had filed the information in the part of her mind reserved for things that were true and important, and hopefully never personally necessary. She had gone back to them when she began watching the Alpha King's patterns change in late October. She had been right about what she found there. She was usually right about things she found in old sources, because old sources were written by people who had observed rather than theorized, and observation was the kind of knowledge she trusted. What the old sources said about the stillness bond was consistent with what she was watching, and what it said about the window was the most urgent part of the knowledge she held, and what it said about what happened when the window closed without acknowledgement was the part she had read twice and then closed the book on, because some information you read once to understand and once to be certain, and then you do not need to read it again. She had carried this for 5 weeks without telling Ryden, which had been difficult. She had told herself she was waiting until she was certain, and this was true, And she had also told herself that telling Ryden earlier would not have helped the situation, and might have destabilized it. And this was also true. And she had also told herself that she needed the time to think clearly about what to say, and how to say it. And this was the part that was mostly true but not entirely. The truth was, she had needed to watch it happen first. She had needed to see Cale Draven in the south courtyard for the 7th time in 4 weeks before she was willing to name what she was seeing. She had needed to see him stop at the archive room door in the evenings, and not immediately go in. Just stand for a moment in the corridor, as though the act of standing in that corridor was in itself sufficient for something he needed. She had needed to watch the wolf settle, day by day, without Cale understanding why it was settling, and understand that the settling was real, and not a phase, and not a coincidence. Then she had called Ryden. She did not doubt the knowledge in the old texts, but she believed in the convergence of knowledge and observation, and she had needed both before she spoke. The formal dinner for the Harfin delegation was not Gareth's first visit to the Draven Palace. He had been here twice before, once 5 years ago for the river access agreement, and once 2 years ago for a summit that had produced no agreement at all, but had been, in diplomatic terms, still useful. He knew the palace. He knew the dining hall. He knew Cale Draven as a negotiating counterpart, which meant he knew the precise calibration of him in a professional context. What he did not know, because it had not been visible to outside observers 2 years ago, was the wolf's damage, and what the wolf's damage meant for the calibration he thought he understood. He made the remark about the girl crossing the service corridor the way he made many small remarks, without calculating the consequence, because he had not yet learned that this particular room no longer had the same tolerances as the one he had negotiated in 2 years ago. The correction came so quickly, with such specificity, that Gareth understood in the moment of it that he had miscalculated. He was intelligent enough to understand this. He was also intelligent enough to understand that the correct response was clean compliance, no elaboration, no face-saving that would require another response. He apologized. He went back to the maps. He would think about it later, privately, and he would make a note about the calibration having changed, and that he would need to account for that in future dealings. He was a practical man. He took the information and updated his picture. He did not understand the full picture, which was not available to him, and would not have been available to him even if someone had tried to explain it. The full picture required knowing things he was not in a position to know. What he had seen, crossing the service corridor, was simply an archivist's assistant. He had no way of knowing what she was. Most people in the palace did not know what she was. The 2 people who understood the most were Merrin, who had known for weeks, and Ryden, who had known for a shorter time, but had been watching with the precise attention of someone who understood what he was watching. And Cale, who did not yet know what he knew, but was 4 seconds closer to knowing it than he had been before the dinner. The handover document took her 4 hours to write properly. She did not rush it. Rushing a handover document was how you left problems for the person who came after, and she was not the kind of person who left problems for people who came after. She wrote the classification system out in full, the logic behind each decision, the cross-reference structure, and why it was organized the way it was, the index, and how to use it, the ongoing records and their current status. She was halfway through the 3rd section, when she became aware that the quality of the building around her had changed. She had been in the building long enough to read these changes the way she read atmospheric shifts before weather, not as specific sounds or events but as a general quality of the air, a texture to the silence. What she read now was not the usual morning business of a large building coming into its day. It was something different, something focused and not diffuse, something that was happening in the upper wing, at a specific point, and moving outward from it. She kept writing. The handover document required her attention, and she gave it her attention, because that was what the document required. But she noted what she was reading in the building, filed it, and kept track of it alongside the writing. She was not surprised, exactly, when Hugh appeared in her doorway. She was more surprised by what he looked like, which was a man who had received information that had moved him in some direction he had not been expecting to go. He said he had heard from the steward that she was leaving. She said yes. He looked at the handover document spread across her desk and said that it was very thorough. She said that she tried to leave things in good order. He sat down in the visitor's chair and looked at nothing in particular for a moment, and then said he was sorry she was going. She said, "I'll be all right." He said, "I know you will." He said it the way he said things he was certain of. "I am sorry for my part in any of this. I was not as forthright with you early on as I might have been." She thought about the morning of her first week, when B had said, "There's been an atmosphere lately," and Hugh had said the previous assignment had been difficult. She thought about all the careful indirect language she had been given in 6 weeks, all the things that had been true, but had been given to her sideways. She did not blame any of them. She understood why. A building that had been living with something for 2 years developed specific ways of speaking about it, specific angles of approach that felt safer than direct address. She said, "You were kind to me. That mattered." He nodded. He sat for a while, the way he sometimes sat in the archive room when the reading was going well, and he simply wanted to be in the room with good work. Then he left. She went back to the handover document. The wall at the northern gate was cold stone through her coat when she sat on it. She had not thought about how it would feel, sitting here, and she noticed now that it felt exactly like what it was. A wall at the edge of a palace, at the edge of a decision, at the edge of the life she had been building for 6 weeks, and the different life she had been building before that. She was not performing anything. She had stopped performing things, if she had ever done it much, years ago, in Penn's document office, where performing was not necessary, because the work was the work, and Penn was the kind of person who appreciated directness. She had carried that habit of directness through every position since, and she carried it now, sitting on the wall in the November cold, with the mountains to the east and the road to the south, and her bag at her feet. She was being honest with herself about what she had hoped when she came to the gate. She had not expected nothing. She had expected that if he came, it would be Ryden who came, because Ryden was the person he sent, and she had prepared herself for Ryden and for the request that Ryden would carry, and for what she was going to say to it, which was that she needed to hear from the Alpha King directly, or she needed to go. She had not fully expected the Alpha King himself. She had thought about what she would say to the version where he came directly, but it had seemed less likely than the Ryden version, and she had not prepared for it as thoroughly. When she saw him come through the gate alone, without guards, in the plain coat, she had understood immediately that this was not a managed situation. This was a man who had decided something and come himself. She had kept her face steady, because she had learned to keep her face steady in situations where showing what she was thinking would have taken something from her that she preferred to keep. She had her face and her steadiness, and the practical composure that had carried her through every difficult thing since she was 16, and she used all of it while she listened to him speak, and she was not performing with any of it. She was simply using the tools that were available to her. The tools were good. She trusted them. What she had not prepared for was how plain he would be about it. The things he said in the road at the northern gate were plainly and completely true, and she had heard truth in his voice before. In the rest of it is correct. In the first left. In the small, ordinary things he had said across 11 weeks of walking past her, or stopping at her door, or standing in the southwest corner of the south courtyard, and she knew what his truth sounded like. This was the same truth, larger and more exposed, said without the management she had come to understand was his default position, and it landed in her the way things landed when they were real. She had held his gaze and told him to say it again, because she wanted to be certain she was hearing it correctly, and because she wanted to see whether he would say it again without hesitation, because a person who meant something could say it twice without it costing them the same way it cost them the first time. He said it again. He said it immediately, and without hesitation, and without changing a word. She picked up her bag. She handed it to him. In the weeks that followed the return, Serafina settled into the new room, the way she settled into everything, methodically and without drama. She learned which window caught the best reading light in the morning, and which direction to hang the sketch on the wall, so that it was visible from both the desk and the bed. She learned the view across the lower courtyard, the shapes of the mountains behind the valley at different times of day, the way the light moved across the stone of the outer wall as the hours changed. She went back to work in the upper floor archive room, the same desk, the same map on the wall, with the corrected tributary notation. The territorial review records were where she had left them. The handover document was in the second drawer, complete and detailed and now no longer necessary, which she found she did not mind. She filed it in the completed document section. She went back to the review records. The work was genuinely interesting. She had discovered this in her first weeks in the room, and it was still true. The Territorial Review was a complicated, multi-layered legal and historical puzzle, with real consequences for real people in real places, and she found this kind of puzzle deeply engaging in the way she had always found records work engaging. Because records work at its best was the work of understanding what had happened and making sure it could be found and used by the people who needed it. She understood the story the records were telling. She had been telling it for herself for 6 weeks, and would continue for however many more weeks the review required. Ryden wrote the last entry in the private journal on the evening of the dark moon, which was a Friday in November. He wrote about the day's council session, which had produced the final version of the Northern River Allocation Agreement, and about the conversation he had had with Marin in the afternoon, and about what he had seen from the upper wing window earlier in the day. The Alpha King crossing the outer courtyard at midday and stopping to look at something below the east wall, and the archive girl visible through the window of her room above the courtyard, also looking out at the midday light, and neither of them aware of the other looking. He wrote, "I believe they will be all right. I believe this with more certainty than I have believed most things I have written in this journal." He wrote, "The wolf is settled, the bond is building, the Alpha King is sleeping, which is more than I could say 4 months ago. The palace is better." He wrote, "Serafina Vale came from the Hollow Valley Archive with a single bag and a letter of appointment, and an entirely appropriate level of nerve, and she stood in several corridors, and looked at several uncomfortable situations, and did not flinch from any of them, and I am of the opinion that the pack is in better hands than it knows." He paused. He wrote, "She does not yet know that she is, in the deepest sense, one of the most important people in this building. She will. She is a very precise person, and she is paying close attention, and by the time he is ready to tell her the full extent of it, I think she will have already arrived there on her own." He thought about this for a moment. He thought about the way she had said, "I am not staying because you need me to," at the northern gate in the November cold, with the bag in her hands and the mountains behind her. He thought about the way she had handed the bag over. He wrote, last, "She knew exactly what she was choosing. She chose it anyway. That is the only way any of this works." He closed the journal. He put it in the drawer of his desk. He did not lock the drawer. There was nothing in the journal anymore that needed to be protected. The story it contained was real and completed and could be locked away now, or read, or neither, because it had served its purpose, and the purpose was done, and what remained was not the story, but the thing the story had been about. He sat at his desk for a while in the quiet of the evening, and thought about nothing in particular, which was a thing he had not been able to do in 4 months, and found it genuinely restful, and went to bed at a reasonable hour. Outside the east wing, the night settled over the Draven Palace, in the ordinary way of a winter night settling over a place that is at peace with itself. The river in the valley moved south the way it had always moved. The mountains held the dark the way they always held it. The stone of the old building held the warmth of the people inside it against the cold outside. In the east garden, the bare winter beds held their shapes in the dark, waiting for the season to turn, and for the things that would come back in them to come back. They were patient. Good gardens were always patient. They understood that growth took the time it took, and that the structure you built through the cold months was what made the spring possible. Everything worth having was like that, in the end. Everything that lasted was like that. There are things that a building remembers, not in the way that people remember, not with intention or selection, but in the way that stone remembers temperature, and corridors remember the weight of the feet that have moved through them over time. The Draven Palace was old enough to have accumulated a great deal of remembering, and the people who worked within it for long enough sometimes developed a sensitivity to it, the way you developed sensitivity to the moods of anyone you spent a lot of time with. Serafina had been developing this sensitivity without naming it. She felt it most clearly in the early mornings, when the building was still, and the day had not yet put its particular pressures on the air, and she could walk from her room to the archive, through corridors that held nothing but stone and light, and the accumulated memory of everything that had moved through them. She liked these walks. She took them slowly, more slowly than her pace at any other time of day, and she paid attention to the building the way she paid attention to the records, as something with its own logic, containing its own history, worth understanding for its own sake. She thought, sometimes, about the people who had worked here before her. Hugh had been here 18 years, Nora had been here 11, Aldrich had been here longer than either, long enough that he had processed the documentation for 2 generations of the upper wing's occupants. The building held them all, the way it held everything. She was 6 weeks of it. In the building's accounting, she was still new. She thought about this in a detached, interested way, not with anxiety. She was new to the building, but the building was not new to her, in the way that she did not yet understand it. She understood it, she thought, more completely than most people who had been here longer. She understood it from the inside out, from the records, and the stone, and the morning light, and the way the quality of the air changed on different days in different parts of the building. She understood also, with increasing clarity, that she was not done understanding it. There was more to come. She could feel this, the way she felt most things, as a quality of the situation rather than as a specific prediction, as the sense that the data she had was partial and that completion was still ahead. She was patient with this. She had always been patient with incompleteness, had always preferred to wait for full information rather than to act on the partial picture. It was possibly her most consistent quality, this patience with the incomplete, this willingness to stay in the space of not yet knowing, while the knowledge continued to accumulate. The knowledge was accumulating. She went to work every morning and paid attention and let the picture build, and she trusted that when enough of it was complete, she would know what she was looking at and what she was going to do about it. She was almost there. The January light was different from the November light, brighter and sharper even though it was colder, and the East Garden in January had the quality of a space that had committed fully to being what it was, and was therefore more itself than at any other time of year. She had been walking it in the early mornings, when the cold was clean, and the building was still. She went at 6, before Hugh arrived, before the upper wing came alive, before the day made its demands. She walked the paths between the bare beds, and she thought, with the unhurried attention of early morning, about the work, and about the winter, and about the spring that would come after. She did not think about everything. Some things were still arriving. She gave them the space to arrive. He was there one morning, unexpectedly, the Alpha King at the far end of the East Garden path in the January light, standing with his hands in his pockets looking at the mountains over the east wall. He had come from a different direction. Their paths had converged at the end of the garden path without either of them planning it. She walked to where he was standing. She stood beside him and looked at the mountains. They stood in the early morning light and looked at the mountains together, and the wolf beside him was completely at rest, and the palace behind them was quiet, and the bare garden held its structure around them like something that knew what it was waiting for, and neither of them said anything for a long time. Then she said, "It is a good view." He said, "Yes." He said, "I have been looking at it for 31 years, and it does not get any less good." She looked at the mountains. She said, "No, I do not imagine it would." They stood for a while longer. The light was growing. The palace was beginning to wake up behind them. The garden held the January cold and the silence of things that were still and waiting, and not quite yet what they were going to be. He said, "Are you cold?" She said, "A little." He said, "We should go in." She said, "Yes." They went in. They went in together, through the east wing door, into the warmth of the building, and behind them, the East Garden was still and bare, and full of the specific patience of a thing that knows the season is going to turn.